Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority Board of Directors meeting. It is Thursday, June 20th, and we have a quorum present. First on our agenda is to approve the agenda. Before we do that, I'd like to make an amendment, please, of currently, we have 5.1 governance process policies. That's actually the policies themselves, but we failed to put them down under policy development to ask the board if there was any development on that. So if we could make an additional 6.1 and drop everything else down accordingly, Deb, that would be great. I don't have any other changes, but does anyone else have any changes or addendums to the agenda as written? If not, would someone like to make a motion to accept the agenda with the requested change?
So moved, Rich.
Moved by Rich, seconded by Simi. All those in favor, raise your hands. And that passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone. Next on our agenda is public comment 1.2. Do we have anybody in the public that would like to make a comment? Deb, is there someone online?
Robert Pulowski, and you are unmuted.
Good evening, and thank you, Deb. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Robert Pulowski. I'm the Vice Chair for the Regional Transit Authority Citizens Advisory Committee, and I'm a longtime transit activist from Southgate, born and raised in Wayne County. Today, I also kind of want to deliver and echo some of the comments that I've made recently at the Regional Transit Authority's Board of Directors meeting this afternoon regarding some of the state budget and what's going on. I do want to deliver some news before some of the board and staff negotiates this later this meeting. Unfortunately, the SOAR bill that has been kind of on the top of our minds for increased transit funding recently has been pulled from the agenda and will not be, unfortunately, discussed and have further negotiations until the fall. It's a very sad news and very disappointing to hear all the progress that some of the advocacy organizations I work with and some around the state have been pushing for, including our transit agencies that have progressed a lot of progress and tried to keep these negotiations up with local reps that are transit supportive, but there has been a lot of ongoing negotiations and drama between the outline of the bill in terms of what's going on and how this will affect certain folks with the SOAR funding due to the current proposal earlier this year from Governor Whitmer's $40 million cut to public transit. With the current service with TheRide, as we now look at it for the foreseeable future, it's not for long, but there is a potential, that we might lose some transit costs, not here specifically in this system. As you all know, TheRide has wonderful support, and with the property tax income that comes in from all of the municipalities we serve, there's going to be tons of funding for the foreseeable future, including our budget that we're going to hear from Dina Reed tonight. But my concern is there a way that we can continuously keep talking with the legislator or ask for more funding from the federal level to continuously keep funding some of these projects? The YTC project is a federally funded project. We have a ton of capital projects that are being funded, but this is also a call to action. So I encourage this board, whether you're in advocacy or not, call your legislators or talk with staff. The more that we get traction on this, the more we can see change. We need increased transit funding. We need transit funding in general. It is a critical piece to how we operate transportation dollars and service going forward into the rest of this year and future years to come. I ask this board, if you are very much a public transit advocate like myself, call your legislators and make your voice heard. This is how we bring change going into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Deb, is there anyone else online? Okay, that formally closes public comment and we will move on to general announcements. I have a few, but before I do, is there anyone else who has any announcements this evening? Dina?
Thank you. I just wanted to share with everyone that we did onboard a new finance manager this week. He is here with us, so if you wouldn't mind just standing up or saying hi. This is Mr. Andy Huber. Andy comes to us from a long history of financial professional, of course, and experience with nonprofits. We're very excited to have him with us, and I just wanted to introduce him to the board. You will see him throughout the budget season for sure, so we're excited to have him on board.
Welcome. On my list is, I want to congratulate Simi and Rich. They have both been reappointed to the Board of Directors by the City of Ann Arbor. Thank you for doing that. I want to announce that our fall policy governance boot camp dates have been changed to 9/5 through 9/6. And if you're interested, please email Deb Holt and more details will be shared when they're available. And lastly, I just wanted to make a quick statement. Yesterday, our nation recognized and celebrated Juneteenth, a culturally significant holiday that speaks to the very spirit of freedom. We acknowledge TheRide's commitment in honoring Juneteenth, both for its employees and the community it serves. So happy Juneteenth. Are there any other comments or? No? All right, then that will close public announcement or general announcements, and we are going to move on to the consent agenda. Would someone like to make a motion to approve the consent agenda as in your packets? Jesse, and then seconded by Mike. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that passed unanimously. Thank you very much. Moving along, emergent items has moved up the ranks this month. And we want to talk really briefly about the July board meeting. July board meeting lands exactly on the first day of art fairs. And so the governance committee considered three different options. We could conduct the meeting here at the library as scheduled. We could move the meeting to TheRide, the main office, or we could conduct the meeting at the Ypsilanti Riverside Arts Center. It was unanimous that the governance committee would like to recommend to the board that we go to the Ypsilanti RAC. However, that doesn't mean that that's what happens. I'd love to entertain discussion. And if there is no discussion, maybe perhaps someone would like to make a motion to approve moving the meeting.
So moved to move the meeting.
All right, so seeing no discussion, Rich is moving that we move the meeting to the Ypsilanti RAC in July, seconded by, I will pick Chris, Alan, and then all those in favor, please raise your hand. And that also passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone, so much. Next on our agenda is our ownership linkage, the Open Dialogue Task Force, and that is by Mr. Rich Chang.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So we had a ODTF meeting, and it was actually really productive. We had really good, hearty, and really worthy discussion, primarily, well, first off, around like scope of coverage. And what I mean by that is, like, we know that overall legal and moral owners are in our purview, but we weren't sure if there's other organizations or folks that we should actually include as part of getting inputs and interfacing with. We didn't come up with a complete conclusion on that, but I think it's actually something that eventually we will want as a board to maybe have get some more input on in regarding that particular topic, because I think it's an important one for us just to make sure that we aren't feeling like, well, we feel like we're actually getting the full large picture, right? Because one of the examples that we brought up is, like, for me in our software world, we always got the requirements from the immediate client, but actually knowing beyond what it is they had in their mind in the future was actually helpful for us to kind of plan for that. And so when it comes to potential partners or other organizations that we want to input on, I think having that bigger picture could be helpful, but it does kind of sometimes muddy the water. And so that's just something that I think we as a board should probably discuss at some point. We also had a really good discussion around the ODTF purpose. Really the values of the owners, of course, is part of that. And then one of the other topics that we did talk about is, like, how do we factor in potentially like an upcoming millage, and how does that factor into how we operate and what we recommend and how we actually discuss the topics that we want to discuss. And then the third thing, of course, was Hugh's report. And the thing that we all concluded is that the personal impact was definitely something they wanted to focus on. And the 3 areas around that was low income, no job, elderly disabled, and then those who do not use our service. And then we actually went through and mapped where do our ends fall and cover these, and also like what are the value priority, and that could be access and fares, and then increased ridership were the two big things. And so then the final part out of that was really around, do our existing ends and policies cover those particular topics? And if so, are they enough? And we didn't have enough time to really dig into that, but that's probably going to be like the next focus of our next meeting. That's all I got.
Excellent. I'm going to open the floor up to the board. Does anyone have any questions for Rich? Yes, Susan?
Rich, could you remind me? I know that I had raised the question about educating our board about the university and its vast amount of transit planning, just so that we're all aware. Because I think what we get in the newspaper isn't transit specific. What was our outcome? I know they're not considered to be an owner, but they are considered to be, of significance. And so do you remember where we landed on getting a presentation and that kind of?
Yeah, so there's two things. I know that the governance committee, we're trying to figure out when we can get them in to present their 2034, 2050 plan. And the other is that there's a continued discussion within the ODTF as to how do we include that type of planning into our overall recommendations as an organization. So that's something that's part of the discussion, I think, as a board that we need to really have a discussion around. Does that help answer? So yeah, we just have to figure out when we can get them in.
And again, it wasn't, I guess just last thing about it, because they're not considered, the city of Ann Arbor, city of Ypsi, Ypsi Township, where that falls in our purview as a committee to be receiving information and conveying information.
Well, I mean, the information for us to receive is, I think that's A-okay. It's just like, what do we do with that? And they're already in communication with staff. And so I know staff has always been aware of these particular plans. So how they incorporate that, I'm leaving that to them. But in regards to our ends and policies, I think it's important for us, once we get the information, to see if, are we actually including some of this? Does it affect our priorities as a board? So I think there's definitely gonna be some discussions once we have that presentation from them. At a larger picture, I think of two things. One is we can go line by line or item by item based on the report. Like, how do we as a board evaluate and incorporate these into our decisions around ends and policies? And the second is then we can always ask staff questions of just like, where do these stand in their priorities and how they map to the long-range plan and other priorities they have.
Where I'm going is we have a role as strategic leaders of the organization. And I think to do our job, I believe we need more information to be able to do that part of our job. There's certainly the work that staff is doing and boots on the ground. They're doing an excellent job. I'm asking more. I'm still striving to understand what our role is at the policy level in terms of priority. I know we're going to have a discussion in a bit about advocacy, but I don't know that we can do a good job if we're not informed enough to be able to strategically take a view at what our role is as an agency.
Jesse, you had a comment?
Yes.
So as far as the ownership question, this is something that the first incarnation of the ownership linkage task force talked when that was who originally defined the ownership, both the legal owners and the moral owners. And there was discussion about whether employers should be included as owners. And where we eventually came down, and this was proposed by the task force and then approved by the board at the time, was that business owners don't have an ownership stake. They are stakeholders, but they don't have an ownership role in terms of except in as much as they belong to other segments of ownership as residents and workers. So the University of Michigan as an entity is not an owner and shouldn't influence the policy that we use to influence or to direct staff. However, as a stakeholder, staff, of course, as you pointed out, has to interact and coordinate with the university as a partner transit agency in the area in order to achieve the ends that we've achieved or that we've set out. We're staffed to find some way of achieving our ends without coordinating with the University of Michigan. I think we would say that's okay as long as you achieved our ends, but given that that's entirely unlikely with the prominence of the University of Michigan and the amount of property that they control and streets, but that's really between that's an operational matter for staff to determine what methods they want to use to achieve our ends. But again, the University of Michigan doesn't have an ownership role to influence our policy. Individuals within the University of Michigan, I myself work for the University of Michigan. I am a moral owner in that regard, and thus my views should be reflected in the context of the ownership as a whole.
Susan, I don't know if you heard what Rich said with regards to, this isn't a closed subject. So the governance committee is closely looking at and working with Matt to discuss. Originally, we thought we were going to get them on the agenda for July, but that had to change because of the burdensome amount of material that we're dealing with the budget. So this discussion is not closed. It's just going to not be handled within this minute, but it is being handled within the governance committee, and I hear that it's being thoroughly looked at by the ownership dialogue task force. Mike, you had your hand raised?
Yes, I did. I just wanted to say the original ownership linkage task force met and determined, after a lot of back and forth, as Jesse had mentioned, who we considered at that time to be our owners. It's quite a few years later. We also have a new coach, and I wouldn't have any problem with the current task force looking at the definition of ownership again. And if they have some other ideas, to bring them to the board.
Yeah, so to answer that, I did actually reach out to our governance coach asking for some input and feedback around. I'm just waiting for a response from them about that. So yeah, it's a meaty topic for us to determine because it does affect a lot of the purview, right? How narrow, how wide it is that we're going to allow to factor into our processes and our procedures, especially with the business plan that's going to get presented and the long range plan and other parts.
Do we have any other questions for Rich? Seeing none, we will close that discussion. Thank you, everyone, very much for that good dialogue. We're going to move on to monitoring our governance process policies 3.5 through 3.8. In general, the board gave itself very high marks for this area. The things that we were working on were pretty much committee structures and things like that, things that are very finite and easy to define. We hit always and most of the time. There was one particular policy, though, that I will call out. It is 3.8.1.1, where we talk about training and retraining and using it liberally to orient new members and candidates for membership, as well as maintaining and increasing existing member skills and understanding. The governance committee has heard your concerns, and we have been working on this. I do know myself, in the onboarding process, it's changed significantly, and we're going to be seeking feedback from the two most recent candidates who have been onboarded, just to sort of ask them, did it meet their needs? Did it not meet their needs? In what way would they change things? But we also have to be mindful that there is a lot of sprinkling of training available. We have boot camps, we have things like that. Last year we had one, our half-day retreat was focused solely on policy governance. And so it's also important for board members to take ownership and attend boot camps and get themselves up to speed with the policies that are in the book. But I am personally looking into all of this and taking your feedback very seriously and trying to get some sort of written, when you go to a new class or whatever, there's usually like a syllabus or whatever about what it is that you're going to learn. So trying to really focus in on what's important so that we can make the first initial meeting with our new appointees very beneficial, but also how do we maintain our skills and increase our skills so that we can lead with excellence through the years. So that was very much heard. Other than that, I was pretty satisfied with what I read. However, that doesn't negate asking the board your opinion on the monitoring report, and was there something that you saw that you would like to discuss? Seeing none, that will close ownership or the governance process policies 3.5 to 3.8. Now, we did move them down to policy development 6.1, and I'm wondering, when you were going through these policies, does anyone have any concerns other than the two that are being addressed by issue briefs this evening with regards to policy language? Is there an area that you feel is underdeveloped or needs rewording, or is everyone satisfied with those policies as written?
And, sorry.
Yes, Rick,
So
go
this
ahead.
is in regards to specifically like 3.5 to 3.8?
Yes, this is what the policy monitoring report, we just closed that, but is there any policy development that you want surrounding 3.5 through 3.8? This is the time for that discussion.
So I'm the one that made that additional context comment where some of these, I just had a really difficult time determining the separation or the differentiation between this particular role is supposed to do X versus that particular role has performed the duty of X. Because some of these, I feel like it's very much like the role is supposed to do X, Y, and Z versus are we actually doing X, Y, and Z?
May I ask for a specific example? That's
Yeah,
I'm
that's why I was like, oh, I'll use X because I don't know offhand which one.
Thank you, Rich.
Well, how about I look that up if, 'cause I don't know if Simi or someone looked like you had another question? No, oh, okay.
Clarification, just like you.
Oh, okay. Let me find one real quick, sorry.
Everybody can take a fan break. It's warm in here.
Okay, so let's take like policy, hopefully this is a good one, 3.6.2.
Okay,
Board committees may not speak or act for the board except when formally given such authority for specific and time-limited purposes. Expectations and authority will be carefully stated in order not to conflict with authority delegated CEO. So for me, I could interpret that as just like, yeah, I mean, that's part of our role and the rules and engagement that we have as a board member. And so then am I supposed to say like, are we actually achieving that or are we not? Because to me, like a monitoring report at this point is kind of too late if we're violating that. So I don't know, it's just odd to me to have, like timing wise, to be evaluating, are we doing this? Because we're probably maybe potentially gonna violate at some point, but I think it should be taken care of at that time. And then, so if we were to have this report, it's like, well, we kind of messed it up. Which I guess the sum of the time would fit there, but
the point of the monitoring report is to review the past year. It doesn't review all the years prior. It doesn't prognosticate the future. So within the last year, when you read this policy, are you aware of that happening? And if so, what was it? If not, then we pass the test. Unfortunately, I think it's like every other job description in that there are bound to sometimes be failures. Again, we cannot prognosticate them, and this tool is to help us become aware and to think about those things and to really think about what we did over the last year and were there any specific incidents that came up to your mind, or was anything addressed within a board meeting that led you to believe that we were not meeting that policy. I do see where it can be problematic. I do know that we are looking at new ways of answering these questions. And we're doing that with 3.0 through 3.4, and then we're going to take a survey as to how that went. And if that helped to make this a little bit clearer, if not, the governance committee will continue on in ways to make these. But monitoring our policies from the governance process policies is very important. Just as it is to monitor the ELs. It's not as finite. So in other words, executive limitations, they come in with what are the, what's the evidence and what's the rationale? These are all open-ended questions, and then you really have to think about your last year's work and if you've been able to identify anything within there.
yeah, no, I definitely appreciate the new format that's being explored, because like I think one of the answers was did not apply for the last time period or something, so.
Okay. Yes, Mike.
I just want to make a quick comment, kind of along the lines that Rich made, but I've done the next monitoring report, which is 30 through 35, I believe, and I had a lot of issues and questions kind of similar to what Rich was just saying with that one.
Okay.
This one didn't look that way to me, but boy, I thought the next one is a toughie for several reasons, which we'll discuss next month.
And if we could keep this in the back of our mind when we're talking about our plan of work, it may mean that we may need to develop a task force to specifically hone in on how we can make this process better and get stronger results that people are not so not flabbergasted is the wrong word, but confused or flummoxed by what it is that we're asking. It is something that we are trying to improve, so I really appreciate your comments, and it is not going to be left by the wayside. So those are things to consider. The governance committee will still be discussing this at least for the next month or two. And then at that point, if we can't come up with something on our own, we may want to consider having some sort of task force just to figure this portion out. Were there any other? Yes, Jesse.
I wanted to get some clarification from you, Rich. Do you think the issue is with the wording of the policies themselves, or is it more the questions that we're asking in the feedback survey? Like if we were to be clearer about the questions, which we've talked about from time to time, would that address the issues? Okay.
Thank you for clarifying. I appreciate that. Any other comments or questions? All right, seeing none, we're going to move on to the safety policy 6.2, and that is Jesse Midler.
All right, so a while ago, the Service Committee was tasked with addressing whether there was room for policy development on the topic of public safety. This was initially prompted by a board meeting where several members of the public came and spoke. They had heard that we were going to be, that TheRide was going to be inviting police officers to have a prolonged presence at the Ypsilanti Transit Center, and that was not something they were in favor of. While that was not actually something that was being planned, there was an ethic or a value that was being expressed that the presence of police officers was not necessarily something that promoted a sense of safety for some people. And that tied into previous concerns that had been expressed at various points about overall feelings of riders feeling safe using our services. And to that end, the Service Committee has been discussing this at length, trying to we looked at the existing policy language that might exist on how we have some policies in treatment of the traveling public, but we decided that there was not actually a policy that set out that really did clearly guide the agency in terms of how public safety, how feelings of safety were to be, how a feeling of safety was to be achieved or maintained. In consultation with our governance consultant, we're making a recommendation first that that the board set as an end that riders feel safe using our transit or using our services, and that word "feel" is actually very important for the discussions that we were having, because it doesn't really matter how many statistics we can show that that we have no instances or very few instances of assault or people being injured in accidents. The thing is that people need to feel safe using our services, and that is something that might prevent a feeling of not being safe, is something that might prevent a woman wanting to wait for a bus at a stop that's not well lit at night, or someone who might feel that they are at risk of harassment from other riders on the bus. Even though we do have policies saying don't do that, we have not really, or rather there are rules at TheRide saying that you can't harass people. There is no policy from the board laying out that expectation. So the point of putting, we discussed whether that was to be an executive limitation, but we heard a rather convincing argument that a feeling of safety using public transportation services was an end to be achieved in of itself, not just a limitation on how the rest of the ends were to be achieved. And then after our plan is, if the board does decide, agree to make that an end, that once that end is established, we can look into executive limitations that would guide and set guardrails on how that end is to be achieved. And so we will look, there was no consensus about policing, for example. There's a lot of ownership linkage that needs to be done in that regard, and we are having those conversations, but we felt that it was more important to have the end established first as a guideline before we continue working on more specific policies. I bet just about cover what we talked about. All right. So in your packet, we have two options for proposed language. Sorry for not having that right at my fingertips. Oh, 30 there. Sorry, I saw suggested policy language change. All right. So you'll notice the two proposals are very, very similar. The only difference is whether we use the term riders or members of the traveling public. I think the brief reason why we're putting both of those forward is that we weren't sure whether the board would want to set out riders as the like the subject of this policy, or if we wanted to be more broad and cover people who might be interacting with our facilities and services without actually riding. So for instance, someone passing through the transit center, but not actually getting on a bus. So that's the question, I guess, that we are, the questions that we're putting to the board is, do you all, how does everyone feel about this as an end? And if this is something we want to do, who is the subject?
Can I just add a little extra? So,
Yes, please.
because like the traveling public also includes like bikers, cars, walkers, so it's a pretty broad group that traveling public covers. So there's some financial potential and legal implications I think we have to consider around that.
Jesse, are you ready to open this up for questions
Yes.
and dialogue then?
Yes.
If people would be kind enough to raise your hands, I'll acknowledge you. I see Mike.
Yes, thank you for the explanation of what members of the traveling public are and why you had a separate category there. I guess my feeling, first of all, before knowing what that is, it just seemed a lot better to say riders because that was specific. And the members of the traveling public is pretty amorphous. And now I understand why you were thinking about that, but it still seems to me not specific enough. And that it needs to find more specifically so that we know what we're talking about. And I guess I still, from hearing your examples, I still feel that I would favor the riders. It's something we have more influence over. The ride does.
Susan.
Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit of the credit for confusing it, because I was describing that, at least for me, the safety policy should also consider the buildings themselves, which can be either good neighbors in a downtown or sites of attractive nuisance, where misbehavior could happen after hours. And so, if, for instance, the design of the building should not be encouraging people to be in the dark corners doing all the things they're doing, because anybody walking by or our riders would be impacted by that. So I wasn't sure how to describe it because it's not the traveling public, but it's just we want to be good downtown neighbors in that development of those facilities. So I was the one who complicated it beyond just simply those riding. And I'm not sure that I have, to Mike's point, the correct word. He's absolutely right, we should be specific.
Any other questions or comments?
Maybe before we get, spend too much time on the semantics of it, are there any board members who feel that that this is not an appropriate end where we do establish the proper, limit or the proper subject? I want to make sure that, because I think that's really the issue is, are we ask the question of, do we want to address public safety? This is the response that the service committee has come up with. Does this meet is this going towards the goal that the board has set out for us?
I'd like to take a consensus if that's all right. Why don't we, by a show of hands, are we in agreement that the ends is the appropriate place to start? And if everyone who agrees with that would raise their hands, I think that might help you address the question. So let's just go ahead and raise our hands or not raise our hands if we're in agreement. So it looks like we are unanimous that we do believe it goes to the end, so that helps you with your work.
That's actually a huge load off. Thank you. Okay. And then I definitely agree that riders is too specific, I think, than I think we really want, but members of the traveling public on its own, like, are we responsible for a member of the traveling public elsewhere in the city?
Would it be appropriate then at this time to have that go back to the service committee to sort of drill down and figure that part out rather than here? And that possibly, if you're not on the service committee, but you have thoughts or feelings, maybe zip an email off or contact Jesse or anyone on the committee and let them know any ideas that you may have about solving the conundrum of how do you, riders again being specific, but members of the traveling public feeling more amorphous.
If I could draw things out just a little bit longer,
Of course.
I think it might be helpful to have some guidance on, or maybe some ideas to start off with on who to include. So obviously we do want to include riders. Julie?
I think if we have it just as riders, then if we have policies where riders feel safe, then probably everyone else who comes into contact with them will generally feel safe. Like if we do things like thinking about what Susan suggested about the infrastructure, for example, and I don't think that needs to go into the ends, but that's part of it, right? So I'm comfortable given our mission with just leaving it as riders. I'm not sure that it's worth your time to go back and deal with the semantics of it. I think if riders feel safe, even though, yes, we acknowledge that we want people who walk by the riders to also feel safe. If we do things to make our riders feel safe, then they'll probably also feel safe.
There is one way to solve this. We could have someone make a motion to your point and see if it passes, and then if it does, the discussion is done.
Just trying to think if there is a counterexample just before I would appreciate a little bit of time to just mull that over.
So, I mean, not to belabor it, but I was grateful that Jesse took this on this week. For weird reasons, I was turning on the TV set, and for whatever reason, one of the Detroit channels just again and again and again was showing footage of a rider being assaulted at the Detroit Transit Center. And it wasn't clear if the person doing the assaulting was also a rider or it just happened to be somebody there, but the point was it did horrible things to all of us who are encouraging transit, to those people who are fearful about using transit. It's just, it made it clear that we have to be aware there's a PR element to this. And again, I only know what I saw on that video clip, which unfortunately they just seem to want to just show repeatedly. So I just, again, I don't know if the two people involved in that incident that was caught on tape were either riders or someone who just happened to be there causing mischief. There was a PR piece to this that anybody seeing it would say, well, why would I want to ride a bus if that's what happens? So I just want to be aware of that. It's a bigger question that affects our ridership.
Jesse, you are the chair of the service committee, and this is your committee's initiative. I'd be happy to support whatever your decision is. Yes, Rich?
So I guess maybe this is the use case, and it might be somewhat of what Susan was covering, because, for instance, we as a service do not provide 24/7 round-the-clock service. So say it's after hours, like 2 a.m., with the new Ypsilanti Transit Center that's being built or it's built. We don't put up a gate or a wall, right, after hours to block people from access to that. If someone does have access to that, and who knows what they're doing, but I mean, is that factoring into where Susan talks about like the public aspect of you? Like if after hours, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens that makes the news, does that scare people away from wanting to use our service? And is that something that we would want staff to, for instance, have maybe 24/7 monitoring, security monitoring through cameras or something to help achieve that feeling of public safety? Because then they know it is being watched. It's not just like, once our service stops, we stop really monitoring or caring about that property from a real-time monitoring aspect. Is that something that we want to cover or not? So that's not really a rider per se, right? This is access to our facilities that aren't walled gardens.
And so I think I am going to bring this back to the service committee. Haven't had some time to give it some thought, because I think there is a little too much ambiguity in terms of who is a rider and when they become a rider. Is someone waiting for a bus before they get on a rider? So we might think so, but I think a reasonable interpretation is that could be that this only applies to people who are actively using our services, which is not the scope that I think we wanted to include. We do want to include people who are waiting to use our services. But I do hear that members of the traveling public on its own is too broad. So, sorry, we're gonna have to talk about it some more. But at least we have a very specific thing to talk about. So I appreciate the board's feedback that the policy, for the most part, is an expression of what we're looking for, and we just need to fine tune this one point. And in recognition that we have a lot more left on the agenda, I think I'd just like to close this topic.
Mike, you had a quick question?
Yeah, I have one suggestion for the service committee when they're talking about this again. I notice you suggested it is a new 1.1.3. 1.1 says residents in the area have equitable access to public transportation services that enables full participation in society. That doesn't seem like it goes there. I think you just should consider that.
So there was I think overall, there's someone has been pointed out by our governance consultant that the term, or that the goal of providing access may not be actually what we're wanting to do, that we actually want people to use those services. So if it's the access to services, I think they're, in terms of placement, we can look at that, but I think there's a potential for a slightly larger restructuring of the existing ends that might cover that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, to me, there's an emphasis on equitable there,
Right.
which isn't being reflected in.
And just
What's
as a
suggested?
refresher, the ends next year, 2025, we will be taking a deep dive to all the ends, and that will hopefully help answer some of the questions that are coming up. So it's going to go back to the service committee, and you're going to come back to us
Yep.
in July. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for all your excellent input. We're going to move on to board job description 6.3. At the last meeting, Mr. Chang brought up the fact that there was a kind of a little bit of a conundrum with the regards to 3.2, where it says in the job description that the board has direct responsibility to create, and we do not create. The example that he used was 3.2.7, which says approval of the annual budget developed and recommended by the CEO. We don't create that, so it was suggested, it went to the governance committee, we reviewed it, and we came up with a policy language change of going from to create to for. Which is in your issue brief here on page 34. It's pretty straightforward, but if you have any questions or discussion on this, we can entertain that now. If not, I'll accept a motion to accept the policy changes written. Yes, Simi.
I'd motion to accept the policy change as recommended.
Seconded by, supported by Mike. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that, I'm waiting. And that was a unanimous vote. Thank you so much. The next one is, as we were going through these policies, 3.7.2, it popped out that it currently states that the executive committee would, let me see, pardon me. The executive committee, under emergent issues, it says their recommendation, we're recommending that task force appointments be eliminated from the executive committee language. The reason is in our bylaws, Article 4, under committee section 2, it specifically states that committees shall be recommended by the board's governance committee, shall be established by the board, and the board chair will appoint chairs and assign board members. So we're in direct conflict. So what we're asking is that the word task force members be eliminated from 3.7.2 under executive committee. Does anybody have any concerns or questions on that change? Seeing none, would someone like to make a motion that we are going to adopt this change?
So moved, Rich.
That would be Rich, seconded by? It's too hot. Jesse. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you so much, and that was moved unanimously. Now we're going to move on to some really good meats and bones of our meeting, and I think we've left a lot of ample time. We didn't take very much time for this. So the first up on the agenda is 8.1, our business plan by Mr. Carpenter and Ms. Kamau.
Because the CEO's here, so there's going to be a whole lot more hot air. Just going to get that out of the way. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We're getting to that part of the agenda where we get to sort of talk intentionally about a lot of mean stuff. And a lot of what's going on in this section is me asking for your advice. So you're going to hear that as a theme. So I am actively asking for you to tell me what you think about operational means. So that's game on, okay? So I open the door. There you go. So I want to start here with the business plan. I am going to say just a few words at the beginning about what the business plan is, about the purpose of it. Then I'm going to turn it over to Rosa. She's going to walk you through the document. Orient you to it. Really, all we're intending to achieve today, is to introduce you to this document. If we can orient you to it and get started, we've done our job. If, however, you guys want to dig in and you've already read it and you got a lot of questions, now's the time. We'll be ready for that in the Q&A section at the end, so we're happy to start those discussions. So, what is the business plan? We talked a little bit at length a year or so back about what is the business plan, and it kind of gets to what we call the hybrid budget approach that we have here. It's maybe not entirely like some traditional municipal budgeting processes. So let's talk about what the business plan is, because it's a document that is unique to us in this process here. So the document The business plan does a couple of things. It is a blueprint for how we're going to achieve your goals. You have a policy that says all our activities must be aligned to achieve your ends. Those are your strategic goals. So one, this is an alignment tool. It is there to demonstrate how we are advancing your policy goals. It's also a work plan. It's a work process planning. Staff use this to sort all sorts of things, to vet policies, vet projects and initiatives, to organize them, resequence them. In that regard, it's really useful as a communications and transparency tool. I can show you 20 years of initiatives with this document. How you've given us your goals, here's how we're going to do that over a considerable span of time. So I think it's really useful for folks who want to pop the hood, see how this agency is organizing its means and its initiatives and trying to spend its money. What are the priorities for expenses, for example, that are going to show up in later budgets? This document does a lot of that. I would not have to go too far to say this is a strategic document. In many other cases, this might be the first chapter of an annual budget. This might be the strategic plan that comes in early in a year, for example, at a retreat or something to that effect. So it has a lot of importance in that regard. It does drive our annual budgets. Now, Dina and I have reminded us all over the years that kind of 95% of our budget is already spoken for. It's there to keep the wheels turning, to deliver the services that we've already promised. But we do have 5 to 10% of our budget that we use to make change, that we use to advance, to innovate, to do new things. And this document, you're not going to see a whole lot about the routine things, the everyday things that we do. We're not saying they're not important. They're incredibly important. That's what probably 9/10 of the agency's personnel are consumed with. We're saying that this document is about the future, it's about change, so we're focusing on those elements of it. It does drive budgets. What you're going to see in this and in our budget documents is a mixture of multi-year plans, in this case 20 years. But I want to remind everyone that we do one budget at a time, 1 year at a time. So when we talk about what's the expense that you will be asked to approve in the forthcoming budget, it is very much just 2025. What happens in 2026 through 2045, that is for context. That is to help us understand how that first piece leads to the broader parts. And, I think another really important thing the business plan does, I'm going to speak a lot more about this, it gives us an opportunity to learn from each other, to hear our concerns. It is very much a listening document. To hear from you, to hear from the public, to hear from staff. What have we forgotten? What should we include? Why does this initiative come before that initiative? These are great questions because they allow us to surface many other things that may be going on beneath the surface. So this is very much a dynamic feedback moment. We also spoke last year about the business plan's role as a bridge. And this is in part, large part, because we are a policy governance agency. And this sets up some opportunities for us to use new tools like the business plan to sort of create even better processes. So you collectively as a body began the strategic planning process that drives this and drives our budget some time ago with your written policies. Through policy governance, you speak with one voice as a body and tell me with one voice what you need me to do. That's primarily your ends policies. Those are your strategic outcomes that you need us to achieve. Executive limitations are just the parameters within which they can do that. That is your collective direction. And that is how policy governance generally works. But when you vote on the budget later this year, you're going to vote as individuals for all intents and purposes, because we need 6 votes to pass a budget. So this will put some pressure on you, and the business plan can help us all work through this. Which hat are you wearing? Are you looking at the collective expectations that you've already given to your staff? Or are you thinking about your personal aspirations? I want to be clear, none of it's wrong. This is the opportunity to begin to surface those things, to reconcile them, to share them. Who knows? Some of you may have an interest in a budget item or something that could lead to a new policy. Like, this is entirely appropriate, and it's the business plan as a bridge that allows us to kind of have that conversation. As I said, it's also a great opportunity for us to just listen and hear each other and what's important. So again, whether that leads to a policy or a business plan initiative or a budgetary expenditure, we can sort that out as we go. So one last thing, and I think I showed this to you guys before. This is just kind of illustrates the difference between how some budgets operate, where the budget approval itself is kind of the last step of the strategic planning process. For us, it's more the first step of the implementation process. You already gave us your strategic goals a long time ago. The business plan just organizes how to do that. That means that hopefully, when we do the budget, when we set your policies and the business plan, we uncover all the frankly important things. And that the budget approval in September, at the end of the fiscal year, is frankly, I'm not going to call it a housekeeping issue because I don't want to diminish a lot of work that's going into it. It is a big document. But hopefully by that point, we've talked about everything that needs to be talked about. If any of you have an individual concern you want to voice, we've done it here in this document, and it is or is not reflected in the budget. So that makes the budget itself, frankly, less important as a strategic document, and it's more, yep, we've talked about everything, and let's get on with executing it. So with that in mind, I'm going to sit down, and I'll let Rosa Maria Kamau come up and tell you a little bit more about what's in the document itself. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So the business plan focuses on increasing ridership. We have 49 projects and initiatives that have been prioritized and organized to occur from a period of 2024 to 2025. By transparently identifying these initiatives, the business plan provides an opportunity for the board, staff, and members of the public to have a dialogue before the budgeting process adds financial details. So the business plan has 3 thematic buckets. The first is attracting ridership. The second is retaining ridership by providing a service of excellence. And the third is increasing internal efficiencies by continuous improvement. Now, in this business plan, unlike the previous business plan, we've added sub-themes so we can further categorize the projects. I'll go through the buckets high level, and then we'll proceed. So the first thematic bucket, attracting new riders and increasing ridership, has 17 projects, and it will begin into looking into ways that we can increase ridership without necessarily incurring additional operational costs. Beyond that, we will look into potential target markets for growing ridership. This will inform the development of focused and effective marketing and advertising strategies. To accommodate the anticipated increase in ridership, infrastructure will be expanded and service provisions enhanced. Moving to the second thematic bucket, you may remember in 2022, we conducted an onboard survey, and 92% of the passengers who participated indicated that they were satisfied with the services that we offered. Beyond that, last year, thanks to George's group, we've been having senior staff riding the buses every quarter, and we're looking for additional ways to improve our services as well as our infrastructure to enhance the customer experience. In the third bucket, we'll be addressing internal continuous improvement, and this will focus on improving the staff experience and improving internal efficiencies so that the team is better positioned to support the mission, which is increasing ridership. So I'd like to orient you to the document itself, and I'd like you to turn to page 47 of your board packet. It's page 10 of the business plan. It looks like this. So this is a new addition that we have in this business plan comparing to the last year's business plan. And so what we're trying to do is, beyond having the thematic buckets and the sub-themes for those thematic buckets, we're starting to number all the projects in a consistent way between the business plan itself, the Gantt chart in here, and you can follow the and see the page number that that project is for additional detail. So for example, if we get to the Gantt chart, and we'll get to that later, and you want to get additional information of a particular project, you'll just come to this page and then follow the page number of that particular project like you would do in a table of contents, and get more details on that particular project. So moving on, I'd like to orient you to the previous page, or actually to the 11 by 17 that's on your table. It looks like this. This is a Gantt chart of all the 49 projects. These are all the projects that we plan on having. I hope you can read them. For today, since it's just an introduction, I will just orient you into just being able to see what's there and be able to read it. So the first column will have the 3 thematic buckets. You'll see attracting ridership, excellence in service delivery, continuous improvement. And then from there is the sub-themes. And then on the 3rd column is all the projects. A new addition to this Gantt chart is that since all the projects will be feeding into either the operating budget or the capital budget, we've started clarifying which of the budget each project is going to go into. And then beyond that, we write which board policy it advances. Then from that column all the way to the end, those are fiscal years. Now, the budget is planned based on fiscal years, and so all our projects are provided in fiscal years. So just to have an easy conversation, if we're talking about project 1, it's delivering new millage services, and that's for the previous millage that passed. You can see that in fiscal year 2024, which is now, it's continuing, and that project will be completed in fiscal year 2025. Jeff and Matt will be talking about the second project, which is finalizing and implementing the advocacy agenda. So that project starts today from that presentation, and then we'll continue into fiscal year 2026. And those advocacy efforts or the agenda is going to create advocacy efforts that will continue all the way into 4045. They'll be ongoing, and they may be revised, but if there's room for revision or need for revision, then they will let us know. So that's basically how the projects are arranged. I want to note that for most of the long-range planning projects, they will have a planning and delivery as well as construction. So from project 8 all the way to project 12, you will see there is P&D for planning and delivery, as well as short form of construction. I will be available to get into the details should you need or to answer any questions on the Gantt chart, but I hope that provides you with enough information to be able to read, and then based on the project number, like I had said, you can go through the table of contents on page 10 and then get additional information on each project. So I would like to just get into the details of a few major projects, and all the projects are important, but I just want to talk about a few projects. The first one I was going to talk about is the advocacy agenda, but I'm going to let Jeff and Matt talk about it in a few minutes, so I'll leave that for them. The next is the environmental sustainability projects. So the board asked the agency, actually directed, not asked, the agency to work towards carbon neutrality. So as you will see from project 30 to 37, we have projects where we realize that we don't know how much of emissions that we're producing right now. So part of the things, the projects that we have in place is a tool to be able to track our emissions. So we want to know how we're doing right now. So as we progress, we're able to know how well we're doing. So you will see there is from 32 to 37, that's 6 projects on sustainability planning. Then next, I'd like to talk about the critical path to growing ridership, and that's project 8 all the way to project 12. You will note that we start with expanding infrastructure. So by expanding infrastructure, we're talking about the redevelopment of the YTC and the BTC, as well as having a new garage. So this is going to ensure that we have enough capacity to grow our fleet. So by expanding the capacity to have more fleet, then we will be able to actually expand the fleet. From there, we'll be able to talk about building a BRT, increasing the frequency, and providing faster, reliable services in a way that transit will be more preferable compared to the use of personal car. So in closing, I'd like to say that all the 49 projects are there to advance the board's goals. And through this introduction, we're really looking for your feedback. We want you to read the document. We want to get your feedback so we can improve this document before it's adopted into the budget for implementation. So the next steps, today is introducing the business plan, getting your feedback. And then in July, we will begin to finalize the business plan and start handing everything over to Dina so that she can start drafting the budget, and she'll present the first recommended draft of the budget, the first draft of the budget in July. So for the board, as Matt mentioned, you can provide feedback on pretty much anything that's important to you. So whether it's on the policies that drive the strategic direction of the business plan, or it's on your own individual interests, we would like to hear that. Send your questions or any type of feedback that you have during the committee meetings, or call or email me or Matt. We're requesting that you do that by July 10th so that we're able to compile all the information, answer the questions before we hand over the documents to Dina. For the members of the public, we're asking that you please get a copy of the business plan in our website. We have it at TheRide.org. And send any questions that you have to tell us at TheRide.org by July 10th as well. I will be monitoring that email, and I will provide answers to any questions that you may have as well. So thank you very much, and we will open it up for any questions or discussion.
The floor is open for the board. Does anyone have any questions? Rich?
First, I want to say, as always, really super impressed with just the amount of information that you provide to us.
Thank you.
I know that these Gantt charts, there's probably a lot more details, but I greatly appreciate it. I mean, it's gives me reassurance as to why you are so effective at what you do. I did have a question around one specific one, and it's something that we can discuss later, or if you want to answer now, but it was item number 5, which is the fare strategy review. Because I know fares is a really important component of, it's one of our budget line items. And I was just kind of curious, and it might be that I'm not understanding what that particular item covers, but I was kind of curious why it's only 2 fiscal years. Like, to me, it seems like that would maybe be something that at minimum would be maybe every other year, if at best every year, to kind of evaluate. Because I know that we, as a board, have asked in the past about, like, hey, what would the situation be like if we actually had no fare, and whether that's even possible, right? But to have this be, you know, a fiscal year 2024 through fiscal year 2045, and only have that fare strategy review only be 2 of those years, that seems a little too minimum. So I just, maybe it's because I'm just understanding what that strategy review is, and maybe you are doing something consistently throughout time.
Okay, so I will try and, actually, I'll have Dina go ahead. Okay, I will try and answer it, and then I'll have Dina chime in. We have a lot of, so with this project, what we're trying to do is we're trying to update the structure and improve the collection systems. We're also trying to see post-pandemic, what are we learning? If we can improve real-time information and be able to provide, so for example, using mobile gadgets, like what trends are we learning from that perspective, and then adopt that. I'll let them go ahead.
Thank you.
ahead, Dina.
Happy to add a little more context to that. So we definitely do look at fairs annually, more than annually, probably quarterly, and in the reviews that we have with the board and such. This is really related to looking at all of our fairs, how they're functioning. You may remember a few years ago, we did a fair study. Then when the pandemic hit, there was an update to that study, and a result of that was that we recommended some fare changes to the board. And the board approved those, and then we moved forward with them. And at that time, we had actually reduced fares in some areas, not the base fare. It's been $1.50 for a long time, but it was like 30-day passes and things like that. And that all came from that comprehensive review. So what we're looking at, and Rosa Marie is correct, in that we want to align it with opportunities that we have with what we use to collect fares. So we have technology that we use. We have, the fare collection on the buses. It's a look at, do we want to do that differently? This is very timely because we do have some issues in terms of the useful life of our current fare boxes coming to the end of their useful life. We're going to have to replace them. So when we want to think about how to do that, we want to do it strategically and make sure that we're buying something with the right hardware and software that will meet the needs that we have for quite some time to come. It's also very timely in that it's in the same range of when we're doing planning and design for the YTC. So if we decide we want to do some kind of fare collection that's not on the bus, but also on the platform or something like that, this would align with that. So it's not only to evaluate what our fares are and how they're functioning, but it's an opportunity for us to look at maybe how we collect fares as well. So a very strategic look, and it's not something that you would want to change your mind frequently. You have to make, strategic decisions about how you do that. So this would be the next time. And I think you might remember that we did promise to do this a few years ago when the board did approve those fares. And we said, this was comprehensive, but we do feel that there were more opportunities to look at some other fares that we have and see if they make sense the way that they are. We have a very complex fare structure, and sometimes that can be difficult administratively to monitor, to collect, to keep track of, and even sometimes for operators to know what all the different fares are and the different cards and the different things. So we will be looking at all of that to determine if we want to make improvements to that and making recommendations to the board. Another note about fares is in order to change fares, not only do we need board approval, but we would need to make sure that we've done comprehensive analysis per the FTA. So we have to do studies to make sure we're not causing adverse impacts or things like that. So there's a whole process that goes along with that. And that would be aligned with probably what recommendations coming from the fare study would have to go through that process before a fare could be changed.
And I'll add one other thing. I think, Rich, you may have noticed that further down the Gantt chart, some projects do repeat. And I can point to Project 41, Collective Bargaining. That's one where we can predict with a certain degree of accuracy when that process is going to happen. And so we know it's going to, I mentioned work planning. So we know roughly when that's going to occur. We can carve out some time in our work plan to say, okay, let's make sure we leave a little extra bandwidth to do that. The fare study could evolve into something similar, where we adopt in this business plan more of a regular cycle. We haven't established a need for that yet. And as Dina said, we look at fares every year anyway as part of the budget process. So that is happening, and it may be that in the future, one of the outcomes of each of these things is, maybe do it every 10 years or something like that, in which case it would start to show up on the Gantt chart that way.
Any other questions or comments? Jesse? Then Simi.
Thank you. For the bus network review, it's, I think we have that on for 24, 25, and 26, and then every 5 years. What would we see in the, like, in the budget to reflect that? Like, what does that work look like, and how would that be reflected in the budget?
Forrest, do you want to say a little bit about what the bus network review is and how it might manifest in a budget?
Hello? Yeah, good. Sorry about that. A good question. If you remember the long-range plan, they propose a little bit different network, high-speed, high-frequency network plus some priority BRT routes. So basically, the review is going to start to align our network to that long-term transit network. We also have some existing operational issues. For example, running time and being late on time, reliability. So through this process, we're going to review that as well, almost like a comprehensive review of all the fixed route services and see where the issues can be addressed through this process and how we can align that, the whole network, to the long-term issue.
So, like, as a budget item, is that like hiring consultants to assist with that work? Is it just this amount of the budget in terms of like staff hours, operational costs will be allocated for the bus network review? Or like how does it look as a project, I guess?
Yeah, from the planning side, probably a kind of a combination of consulting and staff hours. As an outcome from each review, that could affect budget, let's see, but that tied into the millage. So if we make a recommendation for a significant change, that'll be part of the millage plan.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Simi?
Yeah, thank you. I've just got a question sort of about sequencing, and Rosemary, your example around the bus garage, expanding the bus garage will allow us to expand the bus fleet. Sequence there makes sense. For ones that, I'm looking at projects 34 and 35, the zero emissions facilities and support fleet studies. Just wondering how the decision is made to stagger some of these projects. Is it in anticipation of budget or in anticipation of staff time? I assume it's not of budget because that's the next step is doing the budget piece. So can you just explain that for me?
So the question is on the zero emissions facility study and in the support fleet? Right.
That's an example I'm
studies.
using, but more like the sequencing of some of these projects that might not necessarily have like a logical preceding project. So like it makes sense we're gonna do figure out emissions tracking before we do potentially some of these other things. But then with like the facility study versus the fleet and TheRide study, I guess why was it chosen to sequence one after?
Okay, so there is couple things. So for example, with the fleet and facilities that was in the critical path for increasing ridership, that made sense. But internally, we also have to look at staff capacity. Some of the projects would require, for example, a lot of input from IT, especially if they're requiring technological support. So with studies, they would probably require input from one particular department or heavily from one particular department. So those are staggered so that that particular department is also able to do the work that they have in their desk at the moment.
If I might jump in, this is a good opportunity for me to put a plug in for Appendix A, which begins on page 61 of your packet. And this is sort of, and I'll really direct your question maybe to page 69 of the packet, evaluating potential initiatives, key criteria. We do exercise our professional judgment in assembling this work plan. There's no question about that, to your point. These are some of the questions we ask ourselves as we are vetting and discussing projects and initiatives to help us sort of organize them. So we run down, we ask these questions to try to figure out what is sort of, Simi, in this case, sort of the best organizational sequence. Now, for sustainability and the facility study and the expansion of the support and A-ride fleets. In discussions internally, staff, we feel like the support fleets, which are primarily minivans, but there's some other vehicles in there, they are much better candidates for battery electric propulsion than the buses were because of just their duty cycle is very different. The thing we don't know is how much is it actually going to cost to rewire the building to support all 15 to 20 of those vehicles. In assembling the business plan, actually the two things were flipped initially, and then we realized we don't have a cost estimate really for how much it's going to cost to electrify the support fleet. We have a general sense of how we could do a couple of them maybe as a pilot project, and we don't discount that possibility, but we don't know what the exit strategy is for that. We don't know our 1984 garage, which I know I have seen still has 1984 switch boxes and fuses in the big electrical room, which is oddly located behind the bus wash, throwing water all over the place. I don't know how that happened. That equipment's very old. And we know from some of our initial explorations of the pilot project of bringing in the EV chargers, I think we were looking at like 2 vans initially, those dollar figures were pretty high. But we got a couple of different estimates for the bigger ones. The volatility was incredibly wide. We need to do more work. We realized we can roll that into the scope of the facility study you and I discussed, which addressed even things like park and ride lots, for example. So let's get that horse before the cart, figure out that one. Then when we bring forward the proposal to electrify the minivan fleet, we can answer your questions about, well, how much is this going to cost to do the whole thing? Because right now I don't have that answer. And we're going to need to get engineers involved to do that, to get that answer for you. So that is an example of how the sequence of it, when we sort of dig down and use our professional judgment, we can anticipate some of these questions and build them into the sequence of these projects.
Susan?
Thank you. I add my thanks to you as well. There's an excellent amount of preparation. I've got a few questions. I don't want to hog the floor. But the first one is clarification. If I ask a question this year, will I get a response or will it be woven into the PowerPoint? So the challenge last year was I don't know that I ever really understood the answers to my questions. How should I anticipate this year's process working?
We will respond to each of you individually and directly.
I appreciate that. Second question, and these are just sort of in no particular order, trying to understand how the Gantt chart works. We have our transit hubs, and sort of back to my earlier point about the university, at least in my very short understanding of their presentation, there were at least 2 transit hubs where they were proposing there would be transfers with our service, one on Madison, one I think was Mary Markley, and I'm just doing it off the top of my head. Does it not showing up here anticipate we have no expense for those transfer points if in fact we do end up coming together with the university? Because I don't see those transit hubs here. These are just the ones that we will create. And again, if they create it, we happen to stop there, it's not our doing. Is that my understanding?
At this point, the university has not asked us to pay for anything, and the most our conversations have had about those, and I think there's one at Packard and Thompson is a good example. It's an odd triangular piece of property that they've identified. It's a parking lot right now. They've identified it as a bus center. And it might be a really good one. It might be a good place to have a transfer. We might have a stop on it. They may allow us to have a stop there, but they haven't asked us to incur any expense. If in discussions with any community partner, we become aware that there is a cost-sharing element or any of this other mutual project that we do need to include in our budgets and our work plan, then it shows up here. At this point, it's just premature. The university hasn't asked us to really be involved directly. They are kind of doing it on their own. So if that changes, that may affect the organization of the projects.
Okay. Second, very quick question. Can you explain to me how transferring the D2, A2 back to RTA is part of our excellence? I think it's our excellence in service. I'm not quite sure I understand. I understand why we have to give it back, but I'm not sure why it falls under that particular category.
So that is project
It's an
22?
operational excellence. Yeah,
22 under
22.
operational excellence and excellence in service delivery.
I'm not sure how our getting out of a regional service is part of our excellence. I don't
So
understand the
to be
connection.
clear, we're not talking about the cessation of that service. It would continue operating, just fully transferred over to the RTA. The way it operates right now and has stood up, they pay for everything and frankly make all the important decisions, fares, number of runs, whether to add trips or not. They're paying the freight. We kind of do everything else. We initiated it, we had the vision, we sold it to them, we procured it, and we oversee the contract. But that's all we do. We have, for all intents and purposes, very little actual control over it. So that's a bit of an odd one because it is very administrative sort of thing. It actually has no effect on what the customer would perceive. The bus ran yesterday, it runs tomorrow, no change has occurred. But that one is under operational excellence simply because it is something we need to probably go through some legal discussions to make sure we're spending our liability properly, putting it all to bed. And then it kind of frees up staff capacity. We no longer have to deal with that. We've shifted the whole thing over there. So there are a couple odd projects like that where I think it's a legitimate question. How is that excellence in delivery? It's excellence from an administrative point of view that we have successfully incubated the service and now we're completing the effort of handing it off to the RTA, which was the intent all along. So it's excellence in that we did what we said we would do. But I do want to just clarify, the service doesn't change because of that.
And I may be mistaken, but I believe we have as a goal from the board to have this agency putting resources toward regional transportation. So wouldn't that be a step backwards away from, what other regionalism would we be doing if we actually get out of even that small amount of administrative work?
Sure. So your end is that passenger transportation service exists between Ann Arbor and Detroit. It does. Under this, it would continue to do it, whether we expend any effort or not. To Jesse's point earlier, if I achieve your ends with no effort, I still achieved your ends. So it's still being done. Should we do more? I think that's another question, worth discussing. I will note that in your last ends report, I did give you a CEO note to point out that that ends policy puts us in the RTA's mission because that is their statutory goal. I'm not 100% sure legally it's ours. We've done it, like we executed it. I don't want to leave any people unclear. We caused that service to come into creation. The RTA paid for it and they deserve credit for it, but everything else was us. So we met your goal, we achieved that service, and under this keeps running. So that's the great thing. So the end would continue to be complied with under that.
We'll have more discussion, because we might as well take credit for Greyhound running. It's like, yes, there's regional service, but if we're not actually, well, we'll leave that for another. I had, the question about just a couple wording choices, and I'll get those to you. For instance, deliver millage services. I think what we want to say is that we're initiating or beginning, because then it looks like we're ending them.
Yeah,
The Gantt chart doesn't have a continuation where some of the others have continuation.
That's a good observation, and that's the kind of, maybe a granular editorial, but an important one, because it speaks to how we're characterizing these things. And yes, the Gantt chart really just shows the initial startup. It doesn't show that they continue in perpetuity.
Yeah, and the same as
so-
marketing.
Yeah.
I think that'll be tweaked along the way.
And I should add that there are certain things that once we complete a task, we're not going to keep it on the Gantt chart forever. There are some ongoing projects that Rosa's noted in her footnotes that go on in perpetuity. So there's really no value in putting it on a Gantt chart because it's just going to be a solid line across the page. So some of these things, you know, again, they may fall off the Gantt chart. That doesn't mean that they've services stopped, just that that initial startup effort may have come to completion.
And my last comment, and I'm done, which is I am grateful that you show the vote again for the millage coming up. I'm concerned that we are so, I'm not sure our timing is good with our marketing, and that if our ridership, we're at 80%, we're hoping that we're building it when we go to the community and ask them to support another millage, and we're only just beginning our marketing efforts in 25 and 26. I'm not sure the full impact of that and the timing of a millage. I'm not sure we can make a compelling case, as compelling a case as if we were more aggressive in our marketing. So it's
Sure.
just more of an observation about timing. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good observation. I think she's referring down at the bottom to the black squares. That sort of just identifies things in the external environment, our millage included, that we should take note of because they will be important to us going forward.
Any other questions from board members? Mike?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you, Matt, and you, Rosa Maria, for putting this very detailed and great information in this package about the business plan. In prior years, we didn't get this much information about it. This one, first of all, put it in the right context of how it fits with everything else, which was I kind of had a pretty good idea, and I think most board members did in the past. But getting into this kind of detail, how it all fits together in the details, showing the details of these individual projects, and on the Gantt chart, how they fit together time-wise and so forth. It even ties into the policies, starting with, and having them in the, I guess it was the 3 broad categories, and then those narrowed down a little bit more, and then categorized into these 49 projects. It's really impressive, and I have to say somewhat overwhelming. And particularly, I have to say, when I got to, at home on my desk computer, which is 24-inch computer, when I got to the Gantt chart, I just said, I can't go through this. I don't have time, and I don't have the eyesight or the capability to kind of see the whole picture. Now, with this, I have that ability.
I'll note we do have a plotter at the office, so if anyone wants a poster-sized version, just let us know.
So, first of all, I really want to thank particularly, I presume Rosa Maria, for, there's got to be a huge amount of work that went behind this, a huge amount. And I think it's organized so nicely. And it's, I'm sure it will be very useful to you to track all of these over time. It's so well organized. But what I now that I see the bigger picture, or the more detailed picture that I didn't see or didn't have the capability to see at home, I will go through this and try to look at the individual projects, see how they fit in time-wise and with other events that are happening, which I think is very useful. And I don't know whether I'll want any clarifications on it or not, but I'm certainly now going to spend some more time on it. And again, I'm impressed by this. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me just say, it wasn't one person's effort. George, Forrest, Jeff, pretty much all the staff in this room helped. So credit to them as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't think you were superhuman. I knew there were a lot of other people.
I do believe we have some more questions. Did you want to ask something, Julie? I saw your hand.
Sure, just a really quick comment. This is fantastic. The legends are really helpful, and I'm looking in particular to number 12. So we have the transit hubs, and they're just abbreviated on this Gantt chart, and unless, I'm sure you know it inside out, but if someone who didn't were to look at this, they might not know what those letters stand for. So if it would be possible to get something at the bottom, just to say where those places are. That would be super.
Yeah. Yeah, we can get that.
Any other questions or comments from board members? Seeing none, thank you for such an excellent presentation. I just want to add to the excitement I had when I saw the report. I know that in years past, we would get the business plan, it would be all paragraphical. And sometimes that's very hard to follow. When you get a piece of information, what paragraph do I go back to? So having this index, this way to look at everything, made everything so much more palpable and readable, so thank you. Appreciate it. We're going to close this agenda item and move on to the budget process update, and that is Ms. Dina Reed.
Does this clicker work? Yes. How does it work? All right, try. Hi, good evening, everyone. Okay. So I'm here tonight to just give you a budget preview, and it's probably going to be the briefest presentation I give for the next few months. So we might want to marinate in that for a minute. Basically, tonight, I just want to get you up to speed with where we're at with the process. Talk a little bit about what we think about when we go into the budget process, talk about the timeline a little bit. And I do have, for the first time since I've been with TheRide, some initial numbers to share with you just at a very high level to just give you a context. And I'm mostly going to cover key things, key messages and themes that you'll probably hear throughout the budget process, even though the numbers will definitely change through the process. There are some major themes that we're seeing, and they should continue through the process. So So again, this is our agenda. We're going to go through just a lead in to the budget introduction and talk a little bit about the operating budget. We're not prepared to talk about the capital budget just yet. I'll discuss that in a little more detail as we go through the timeline in terms of when you can expect to see what. But this is where we're at today. So I want to start by just mentioning again, and I'm going to try not to be too iterative here. This presentation is very much aligned with what Matt presented in the corporate business plan, which I think is a good thing. We do focus on advancing the board's ends through alignment with the budget process. And as Matt has mentioned, the budget process actually starts with the board's strategic goals. Ends and executive limitations are what we look at, we think about before, as we're going into the budget process and all the way through. We're also aligning that the business plan is aligned with the board's strategic goals, and that results in what, the long-range plan, our values and principles as an organization, and specific proposals. And then from that, that leads into the more active budgeting process that I'll be sharing with you throughout the summer. It results in an annual budget that we present to you, and it results in the opportunity for us to have a guide on how to implement projects for the next fiscal year. So just to kick things off, we've talked a lot about this already, but I do want to just share that this is what we look at this as the business outcomes. So when we think about budgeting and how this plays into budgeting, it's when we look at what we are funding, how we're funding it, what we're doing, and who we're doing it for, we go back to these ends and we make sure that the corporate business plan is aligned with that, and ultimately decisions that we make during the budget process are also aligned with this. And as I mentioned before, the budget is aligned with business plan priorities. Matt and Rosamaria did a nice job kind of outlining these buckets, these thematic buckets. What I want to say here in terms of how this plays into the budget, clearly we have several initiatives and things that you've already looked at in the corporate business plan, but we look at all of those will not necessarily result in a budget adjustment per se. So as we're going through the budgeting process, a majority of our budget is already focused on initiatives that the board has approved. For instance, the board approved the millage, and in that millage, there were 9 different aspects of what we were going to do. We haven't forgotten about that. We're already funding that. So the good news is the budget will be aligned with everything you've already approved, which we know is aligned with with the business plan and the executive limitations and the ends. But we also want to incorporate next year's specific initiatives. Out of all that list that we just saw, not all of them will result in budget changes per se. Some of them are allocation of resources. So, for instance, an example would be, we want to do an initiative for, to improve on something. We may not necessarily have to increase the budget to do that. We're going to allocate staff resources that we have to the extent we can. But what it also allows us to do is, through the planning process, if there is something that we want to do that's a high priority to the board and a high priority then therefore to staff, and we don't think we have enough resources, by aligning that with the budget, we can then determine, well, you know what, maybe we need some consultant support in order to accomplish that in the timeline that the board thinks is important, or that we as staff think is important to align with your ends. So it could result in a budget adjustment or a budget initiative, but not necessarily in every time. Further, the board has set out executive limitations, and that's what this slide describes. So the board tells us what we can or can't, like what we can't do, right? So this is our lane that we have to stay in when we're budgeting. So you can see that policy 2.4, planning and budgeting, is something that we review in advance of approving the budget. It tells us what things you don't want us to do, or maybe what things you do. It says that we have another policy 2.5, so everything in the light blue there is directly listed in policy 2.4. It tells us that we have to follow all the policies in 2.5. We have to provide a multi-year context, a strategic context, so the board can make an educated decision about our budget. We have to share with you what our assumptions are, what our projections are. We have to have adequate reserves. These are all things that the board sets out, and we review these in advance of the budgeting process and throughout the process to make sure that as we're budgeting, we're meeting these requirements, giving you the information that you need, and budgeting according to your executive limitations. Also, 2.5 is a separate policy, financial conditions and activities. But within that, the board sets limitations on what we can do without board approval. So for instance, we can't purchase real estate without the board's approval. So if someone on staff had the idea that maybe we should budget for buying real estate during the budget process, we would say, we do or we do not have authority to do that. If we do not have authority to do that, we would not budget for it. So we assure you that when we come to you for approval of the budget, we have not put in anything in the budget that would be contradictory to the board's executive limitations set in 2.5. And there are a few more examples of that, but that's how it works into the budgeting process. So here's our budget timeline. This hasn't changed dramatically from last year, other than we're presenting some of the information just a little bit earlier. So we've already reviewed some financial information that's in your packet today with the Finance Committee. And then we're going to be moving into some public review. So the way this is laid out in color is to show you that everything in salmon are primarily primarily staff activities. Everything in the light blue are primarily board activities, and the parts in yellow are public activities. So all the board's meetings are public. That's also public activity, but primarily when we present it in the blue there, that's for the board's feedback, not necessarily the public. So we have specific opportunities for the public to engage. We'll do a public comment and a preview in July where the public will I'll do a presentation to the public, and they'll have an opportunity to respond and share thoughts and comments about our approach to budgeting and the high-level budget that I'm sharing today. The public will never see anything that the board hasn't already seen, either in committee or at the board. And that's how this is meant to function. As we move through the process, we have a requirement to have an official public hearing. That will be part of the August presentation on August 15th. I also want to share kind of how I see this going. So today, this is June, so we are at the beginning. Notice that we're at the beginning of the phase in June with the budget preview with board committees and the board. We have a lot of work to do. And as I mentioned before, all of these numbers will change because we're still working through all the assumptions. So we have a lot of work to do, but we will be including information with the board in July. So throughout July, at each committee meeting, you'll get an update on where things are with the budget, how it's going, where we see things going, and updates on any of the risks or other things that we've brought to your attention. I expect to show you a detailed review of the operating budget in July with a very high-level overview of the capital budget. After July, we should have a better handle on our initiatives to add to the operating budget, because at that time, we will have feedback from the corporate business plan. We can incorporate our initiatives. So in August, you can expect to see the operating budget with noted changes from the July presentation. It will include initiatives. We will call out the initiatives that we've included from the corporate business plan. And it will be a more detailed review of the capital plan, because the capital plan is still being developed in July. But by August, both the operating and capital budgets will be quite firm, and we call that our draft budget. We do not expect major changes between August and September, because the board would want to see anything in advance before we ask for approval in September. We do need the board's approval of the budget in September. State law requires that we have a board-approved budget by the end of September or in advance of the beginning of our next fiscal year, which is October 1. So we will make sure that by August, excuse me, by August, we have presented to you primarily what the budget will look like. Sometimes we make a few adjustments, and we'll call those out just so the board knows, but generally speaking, they're very small. So I want to go through, like I mentioned, just a few budget highlights. The highlights are basically some of the key assumptions that are going into the budget. We are operating at full service levels like in 2025, just like we are this year. We even have additional services based on the millage services. So we have, for the first time, our first full year of millage services in fiscal 2025. We are not planning any fare changes, so we won't be requesting anything like that from the board, and we will present a balanced budget. So some key changes that are happening for the 2025 budget from 2024. So I'm just going to highlight some of the themes that you're going to see. As expected, we expect to have an increase in property tax revenues from the millage. This will be the first year that we're collecting our millage this summer, of the millage funding from property taxes. So that money will be used to fund the expansion of services in the full year of that next year. We will not have any more pandemic relief funds. As we have been talking about, we are using them as quickly as we can to help fund operations. We've used them to bridge the gap with starting some of the millage services a little bit early as the board approved. So we're doing that, and we will have fully expended our pandemic relief funds by this quarter. So by the beginning of next fiscal year, those will be gone. But the good news is that was anticipated in the millage. So we're losing that revenue, but we're gaining the millage revenue. We also will have less state and federal operating assistance. Will is tentative on the state side. There's a lot going on in Lansing with the LBO funding, as you guys have heard, and I'm sure Jeff's going to give an update. But I do just want to touch on that is a significant portion of our budget, something we're going to be watching throughout the budget process. Federal operating assistance, you may remember, was one of the 9 initiatives in the millage proposal. We have been using for a few years some capital funding from 5307 for operating, which is our federal formula funding. We were using it for operating, and the goal was to stop doing that so we could put that money towards our capital projects. And we essentially bridged that loss of revenue to the operating budget with the millage funding. And that will come to fruition in fiscal 2025. So you're gonna see some big swings on the revenue side, but those were all planned for, and does not leave a hole in the budget. So we're whole with the millage funding. So the revenues will go up dramatically because of the expansion of services and the millage funding. The millage funding bridges those loss of revenue gaps, but it also provides additional funding for the expansion of services. Likewise, our expenses will go up because we are having the first full year of the expansion of services in our budget. So while we're phasing in the services this year, a portion of that increase has been this year, but the full year impact will be in fiscal 2025. And that's a vast majority of the increase that you're seeing there. And again, those numbers will change on the expense side, but they will go up. So that's the theme. We also have inflationary pressures continuing. Things have leveled off a bit in terms of the growth of inflation, but the inflation increases that we've been seeing haven't gone down. They haven't gone backwards. So we're still seeing the pressures of that, and we're watching that closely to determine how that's going to go. But like I said, a majority of that increase in expense is really related to the service. And then the net change is that we do expect, we don't know exactly what the number will be, but we do expect to have a small surplus in this fiscal year. You may remember when we did the millage that we set the millage rate at the 5th year, and we did that strategically to make sure we could fund all of the expansion of services through the millage period. We also indicated that that the increase in expense that we're going to see will require us to have a little more in operating reserve to meet our operating reserve requirement. So any surplus that we generate in fiscal 2025 will help us fund that. And then as we go through the 5-year millage cycle, that money will obviously still be in reserve to help fund the growth in expenses. And over time, the millage funding that we get will just pay for the expenses themselves. So as I mentioned, our budget will be balanced. And I guess what I want to share on this slide is just kind of the big buckets of what generates revenues and expenses in our budget. Property taxes and LBO, which is that state operating assistance, are 85% of our revenues. So we'll be talking a lot about property taxes and the assumptions that are going into that as we move through the budgeting process, as well as keeping an eye on the LBO funding, or it's called line haul bus operating revenue, but it's the state operating assistance line in the budget. On the expense side, we want to share that we are continuing to see direct funding for transportation being 80% of our budget. So that just means that 80% of the money that we're spending is to directly support service out in the public and to serve our communities. And that's pretty much the same percentage as it was before, and it's still holding for fiscal 25. And as always, with any budget, there are opportunities and risks, and these will be tracked. These are things that we pay attention to throughout the budget process, and we'll give you updates as we move through the process. But some opportunities that we have are the opportunity to continue the service to our communities. As I just talked about, so much of the budget goes directly towards that, and we're proud of that. We are focused on executing on the long-range plan, both with the expansion of services and other priorities that are coming in the capital side, with reconstruction of facilities and updates to facilities and things like that. We also have the opportunity or the advantage now of having the approved millage through 2028. So financial stability is important, and for us to do our work and to continue to plan and grow. And so we have that, and we appreciate that. We also have all of our reserves funded at or above our reserve requirements, and we have no debt. So those are all opportunities for us as an agency to be fiscally strong. What we need to watch out for and make sure that we're doing is to be fiscally sustainable, is to be very fiscally responsible, be very careful to hold to our budget, even in the face of some of the risks that we have. Some of the risks that we have are the state LBO funding. That's always something that changes. We're not overly concerned about it. I talk about it because there's a lot of discussion about it. It's such a big percentage of our budget. I want you to know we're aware of it, we're paying attention to it, but we don't have any major concerns at this point that it will make a big impact. However, if the state operating assistance percentage changes by even 1% or 2 or 3, it can result in millions of dollars to us, in the tune of about $1 million per percentage. So So if the LBO percentage increases by 2 or 3%, that helps us by $2 or $3 million and so on. It's really based on expenses. So how that works in general is it's a percentage of our operating expenses. That percentage of, if it's 29%, we get 29% of our operating expenses, of our eligible operating expenses reimbursed by the state. So it can really impact our revenue. Cost inflation is also a concern. We think we're managing it well on the expense side, as demonstrated by the fiscal 25 budget initial numbers coming in very close to what we projected. So if you remember last year, when we presented the budget, we presented a 7-year operating projection. Revenues and expenses are coming in pretty much where we thought they would in the initial round. So we feel we're managing well to that. I do have a concern about the capital impact of inflation. We all know and hear about what's happening in the bus industry with bus manufacturers. We've already experienced a significant increase in cost related to our buses. For example, one diesel bus used to cost about $550,000. The most recent order we placed, they each cost about $700,000. And that's not something we can holistically control. What we're trying to do is find other sources of revenue. We have, as you all know, applied for a low-no grant. That's additional funding for replacement buses that we would not otherwise have access to. So by pursuing the zero emissions buses and the hybrid buses through grants, that could help relief on replacement buses. But it is something that we have to keep a close eye on, because we don't know what's going to happen on the funding side, which is the next bullet point here. Federal funding for capital. You may remember that when IIJA was passed, which is the bill that gave us all of the pandemic relief funding for operating, it also had a boost to capital revenue for the formula funding. It was a 30% increase. You may or may not remember that. We have built that in through 2026, but that money is going to expire. And if we don't, if the country does not replace that in some way or another, then we could see a 30% reduction back to the levels that we were seeing before. We just don't know what's going to happen. And that leads me to the next bullet point on risk, which is it's a presidential election year. In any election year, under any circumstances, you can expect that we're kind of assuming that if the current administration were to stay, that they would have the same priorities. That's usually a semi-fairly safe assumption. But we don't know that for sure, even if it's the same administration as it is now. If the administration changes in some way significantly, we have no idea what their priorities will be or what they will fund. So that's just a risk. It's not something we can control, but it's something that we're mindful of, and it's going to be important. And it is important for us to be clear about what our assumptions are with the board and whatever knowledge we have about that as we move through the budgeting process. I really don't expect that to be something that's going to hit us for fiscal 2025, but in terms of providing information in the context of the future and what's going to happen and making decisions today that could impact us later, I bring that up as something to think about. So in conclusion, we are, for fiscal 2025, operating our normal full service levels. We have our full year of millage services worked into the numbers that you saw today. We're not asking for any fare changes, and we have a balanced budget. So that concludes my remarks on the initial budget review. I'm happy to answer questions now or in the future, anytime. There will be lots of opportunities.
The floor has been open to the board. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Mike.
I can't resist. As Dina said, she gave a very similar presentation to the Finance Committee last week. And it contained basically this same information. I think a few minor changes. I want to comment on some things historically, for one thing. It's very positive this year that Dina and her staff were able to get further along by June than has been the case in the past with Dina and prior to Dina too. I think it's really helpful that she has gotten that far at this time rather than later. Mainly internally, but also I think it really helps to inform the board on where we're standing. And also it's kind of we've never seen any preliminary kind of numbers before at this stage. And she emphasized, of course, which is very true, they're gonna change. There's a lot of things that probably can and will change. Assumptions that were made today will probably be refined in the future, and that will make the numbers change. It's also important what she emphasized in terms of the budget is done within the framework of course, the ends, but also the executive limitations. And she highlighted what those were, particularly 2.5 and 2.4 and 2.5. And within policy governance, I mean, that's really what they're limited regarding. And technically, when we get into more details, which will start next month, I guess, the various line items on how much is spent here versus how much is spent there and so forth. That's not the purview of the board officially under policy governance. Certainly it is to adhere to the executive limitations, which are a lot of significant guardrails there. But contrary to the way budgeting usually works in for-profit and not-for-profit and government organizations, it's really not our official role to say, you need to cut this, or we need more money here. They're very happy, Matt, Gina, they're very happy to hear people's opinion, but that's not our role to say, you've got to do this and you've got to do that in the budget. And that's very different than what what I and most other people who've been in budgeting have seen. And we need to keep that in mind. But as you pointed out, we do have to approve the budget, which does have that detail. And that's a legal requirement. We have to do that. And so that's, according to Carver, we wouldn't have to approve the budget. We would have to have the budget within the limitations and ends that we are directed toward. But we do have to approve that budget. That's kind of a technicality, but it doesn't mean that we can't comment on things. I just wanted to emphasize that. And so we're looking forward to the next few months on this. And I hope people can, I have to say in the past, I've been somewhat disappointed that the board doesn't get more involved in terms of asking questions and maybe making suggestions. But I hope maybe we can be working in that direction, that it shouldn't just be the finance committee that does that and makes comments and so forth.
Any other questions or comments from Ms. Reed? Thank you, Dina, for your presentation. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Moving on, we are going to start discussing the advocacy agenda, and we are back to Mr. Carpenter and with the addition of Mr. Pfeiffer.
Thank you, and I'll ask Jeff to come up. He's going to lead the front half of the front 9/10 of the presentation, and I'll slip in at the end there.
Great, thank you, Matt. Hope everyone is doing well. I'm glad they finally got the AC on in here. Don't think they did, no. Awesome. Well, again, Jeff Pfeiffer, I'm the Manager of Public Affairs and Community Engagement here at TheRide. Today, just want to present more or less an overview of the advocacy agenda that we've been working on. This is the first time that the RIDE has put together an advocacy agenda. We look forward to your feedback. We want you to know that this is not set in stone. Some of the items that you'll see today are things that we are currently working on and have done in the past, very much flying the plane while building it. If opportunities have arisen, we are acting on it. I also want to introduce you to the table that's included in your packet, the advocacy table. That has more granular information. I'm going to keep everything at a pretty high level for this evening's presentation. So first, I guess posing the question, what is an advocacy agenda and why do we need one? So an advocacy agenda, and the very base of it is used to help us influence outside policy decisions for us to reach our goals. And what we're looking to build in this is a professional, efficient, and effective advocacy agenda, also very well organized, that puts us in a position where we're able to accomplish our goals in a very set way with principles and guidelines surrounding it, while maintaining the credibility of our institution. You'll remember from Hugh's presentation, our favorability at the RIDE is fantastic with general public, and that's something we're going to want to keep. That extends beyond the public to stakeholders, elected officials, other partners. So we're looking to use this agenda as a strategic blueprint to accomplish our goals. And with that, you'll see a lot of intersect and crossing with marketing and PR. That's just the nature of the beast. They all do intersect, but they are three separate buckets. So for today's presentation, we'll mainly be focusing on advocacy. You will see a little bit of crossing between the two. And we'll go through four major themes. We have four buckets that we'll discuss, as well as tactics on those. And then also just wanted to note timelines. Dina just mentioned, one of the concerns is a presidential election. The nature of politics is it's very fluid and unpredictable. You'll see in the advocacy table, there is on some things year estimates, but most of it are ongoing or TBD. That's just the nature of the beast with anything in the political and advocacy realm. And then lastly, we'll hand it back to Matt to discuss roles. And going back to your advocacy table, you'll notice in column 3, audience. Each item listed in there is going to have a different audience depending on the goals we're trying to accomplish. Kind of a broader one, elected bodies. So obviously, we're going to want to focus on federal, state, and local bodies, elected bodies. We do have advocates in DC and Lansing that handle quite a bit on the federal side and state side, as well as associations. We don't on the local side. So a lot of that does fall on the RIDE and our responsibility to really navigate the local side, local elected bodies. Moving that also extends into commissions, for example, Ann Arbor Transportation Commission, Housing Commission, city councils as an example, as well as advisory boards as well. Administrations, both on the federal, state side, FTA, obviously with our low-no grant application being with the FTA, that's definitely an audience we're going to want to speak to, as well as stakeholders, including DDA, U of M could probably be included in there, associations, including MPTA, our state association, and APTA, our federal association. And then also included grassroots advocacy groups in there. That includes groups like the Bus Coalition that does a lot of work at the federal level. And then also more locally, we have Trains Not Lanes, that's a local grassroots group as well. And I did include the electorate in there. I think that's an example where you see some of the PR and marketing cross intersect with advocacy. Obviously, the voting population is of utmost importance. So moving on to the major themes that we're looking to discuss today, we'll talk about funding first, major projects, transitive supportive outside policies, and then deregulation or cutting some of the bureaucratic red tape. First, want to look at funding. So as you'll see in the advocacy table, we do go through local, state, and federal funding. Obviously, local, the importance of millages with the RIDE's 2022 victory, looking towards 2027 and beyond. We'll want to maintain and increase funding on the local side. State side as well. And I wanted to just take a pause to give everyone a very brief, high-level update on what is going on in Lansing. So when looking at kind of ongoing situation in Lansing, it's important to really look at it in two buckets. First of which is the state budget. That's the kind of the big thing in our main focus right now is ensuring that LBO funding is up to level with the state budget. That is the item that will be passed by the legislature most likely at the end of this month. There was concern when Governor Whitmer released her executive budget about funding levels. I'm happy to say both the House and Senate versions of budget have gotten better, so it's not as much of a concern. Like I said, that budget will likely be passed end of this month. They want to get out of there. It's an election year. They want to campaign. The other item that has been discussed is the SOAR bills. And this is the item we discussed, I believe, last board meeting, where it was redirecting some of the SOAR funds, which are stemming from the corporate income tax, to basically redirecting them. The SOAR funds were a very large pot of money used to entice businesses to come to Michigan. Maybe a little overfunded and some oversight needed. So what the legislature is trying to do is redirect those funds to other items. Some of it does still include the economic development aspect, but also includes things like housing and transportation. Under the current bills, for transportation in particular, we're looking at $200 million a year over 10 years. I think 40 million of that was supposed to be directed to the LBO, and then the rest of the funds were to go into basically a competitive or administrative fund that's split up between the different MDOT regions in the state. Those bills, as was mentioned today, were on the agenda to be voted on today in the House. They were taken off the agenda. I think a lot of it is a timing issue. There's only a couple weeks left and still some conversations that need to take place within the legislature. But there has been an expressed interest in keeping these bills going into the fall. So we'll probably come back to them in the fall. Obviously, recommend keep pushing the support. And I know we have great advocates from our area. Jason Morgan, he's been a really strong advocate for the legislation. And then moving to federal funding. So that's a brief update on what's going on in Lansing. Obviously, that will be an annual conversation taking place. Federal here, going back to the note I had just on the unpredictability and fluidity of advocacy and politics as a whole. It is the presidential election year, as Dina mentioned. There are some things to be aware of there. On the federal side, though, it does include things like our ZEB projects and earmarks, which I think we have an update on those. I don't know if it was included in the CEO report, but Senator Peters did include our $4.3 million earmark request to go to the full Senate Appropriations Committee. This was for the hydrogen fueling station. So more to come on that, but a positive note at that. Next, I'll touch on major projects. I'm not going to go through all of them. I know we have a pretty extensive Gantt chart to look at, and for the most part, the board has been made aware of a lot of the ongoing major projects. I do want to just highlight some of the work that's already taken place on the Ypsilanti Transit Center. I think that's a really good example of showing how us being present in the community and within this sphere really helps build support. I know that with the project ongoing, there's been tremendous public engagement that's taking place, as well as stakeholder engagement that's taken place. And I think that's really important as we look to both build credibility and support for projects and ensuring we're doing what we need to be doing with communicating with the general public as well as stakeholders. In the major projects aspect, I do want to note that some of the larger projects that we have, I'm looking at things like bus lanes, there's a very good possibility we will take hits from the public. Whenever you start infringing on car space, people don't like it. Potential infringing on retail space, people don't like it. So that just stresses the importance again of building our credibility and relationships with elected officials and the public to be able to absorb these hits and still be able to get things done that we're looking to get done. Next thing I'll talk about is transit supportive outside policies. Put them in kind of four major buckets there. So obviously encourage transit supportive land development. YTC is an example of this, I think, with some of the stuff, but also, given the amount of construction ongoing in Ann Arbor, I think it's not out of the realm of possibility if the opportunity were to arise for us, if there's a chance for a higher density population on an existing route or something that can improve our ridership, for us to be more vocal on that. Looking to eliminate financial incentives for cars. I think we've discussed previously that the current gas tax is underfunded, and the state is already starting to look towards alternative options. One of those is a VMT tax or a vehicle miles travel tax. That's something I think that they've included a line item in the state budget to study. That's something that, you know, the RIDE could very well be vocal on, meet with elected officials, obviously a cutout for bus exemption, but that's something that a policy we could help steer and advocate for. Disencourage and improve, there's a pretty good example of both those. I think our current work on the US 23 corridor project is a good example of that, where we offered to MDOT an alternative option that did not require widening of the freeway, and they listened. I think that's something we'll look to do more of in the future, where if something is counterproductive or going to cause us consternation, for us to take a step forward and then also improve overall plans. As I mentioned, deregulation, that's mainly focused on cutting some of the bureaucratic tape that does exist that oftentimes slow down projects and make them more expensive. NEPA requirement for bus pad is a great example of this. If we're able to work with elected officials, both in federal level and state level, depending on the project, we could essentially lower cost and improve delivery of projects. Now, the next slide is really the how. So it's a lot of the tactics that we're looking to implement in this advocacy agenda. Having worked in politics for about a decade or so, I can tell you the single largest commodity you have is relationships in politics. That, coupled with a good argument, it's very, very important. So that falls on us to build the relationships with elected officials, staff, councils, what have you. That really puts it on us to ensure we're out there meeting with folks and building those relationships. Next is education, really ensuring that elected officials and leaders know what we're doing. I think the YTC has been a good example of this, where we did receive 2 earmarks from Senator Peters and Representative Dingell, and we've updated them on progress, be sure to let them know what's going on and what's coming next. In doing that, also educating elected officials who would then educate constituents or have something to talk to constituents about should it arise. The next point is to be present and tactful. Now, this one I do want to talk about a little bit. It basically act when needed. I think it's really important for us to stay in our lane and keep our powder dry unless needed. We are in a community that has a lot of activist voices, and we want to ensure that when we speak, we are heard. And we also want to prevent targets on our back. As I mentioned before, some of the things that we are looking at could upset some folks, so we want to minimize that the best as possible. But also, be in the room and tactful and putting our foot out. The next is expanding PR, public relations, and community engagement. Really kind of the humble brag for us to ensure, again, we're making ourselves visible in the community, helping control our narrative on what we're doing. And the easiest way to do that is to deliver on promises. Really, I think our credibility lies in we do what we say we're going to do and do it well. So continuing to do that is very important. And with that, I will hand it to Matt.
Thanks, Jeff. Well said. So I'm going to speak just briefly about roles. And I've used the sort of 3-legged man. I can see Rich smile. He loves this image. He loves this logo. We've spoken about this one in the past because I see great opportunities for both staff and the board to be directly engaged in this advocacy role. I want to be clear, this is not ownership linkage. That is a completely separate thing. That is your lane, and you let us know if you need any help. This is on the advocacy side, a very different thing. And if we have different people working on it in staff and with the board, we all need to learn how to run a 3-legged race or we're going to trip, fall on our face. So most of this is driven by staff. Jeff is working on my direction to stand up an institutional scale advocacy organization, and sometimes I slip up and say industrial scale. And I mean that. The point of what I try to impress on staff is how effective we need to be in this space. Forest's long-range plan has probably close to $300 million worth of capital, more. more. Most of that's coming from competitive work. We're not going to win that with a nice smile and a good budget estimate. We got to do more. There is some serious competition moving into that space that I'll be honest, we don't normally engage or see here. So this advocacy operation needs to be well organized, professional, needs to be consistent in its messaging. We need to be on message and stay on message and be focused about it. So I see tremendous potential for him and his team to stand up to the staff side of it. And I see a lot of great opportunities to deputize you guys and dragoon you into this operation as well. We see 3 broad categories where this can happen. I want to talk about those just really briefly. The first is what we're starting today. Every year, I want to bring this sort of thing forward to you and have a discussion, very much like the business plan. What are we looking at? How are we doing it? Who are we talking to? You guys see a lot more than we do in many respects. Please share with us. We want to hear. We want to learn. That kind of discussion at this point can only help make this, I think, a better thing. At a certain point, however, we do finalize the agenda, and then we need to move on to execution. Deputizing as a spokesperson. Yes, Jeff and I are the key media-trained spokespeople for the agency. However, sometimes we both agree that having a board member do the talking in public makes a lot more sense. I'm going to pick on Jesse because we have a great arrangement in Ypsilanti where whenever we go to talk to council, Jesse is our sort of point man. And he's the first person to talk to council. He introduces it, and then he turns it over to the subject matter experts who talk about the details of it. But he's there, he provides a face, a voice, a personal connection, the relationships things, right? So this stuff matters. So there are times and places we will come to you individually and say, hey, we got a thing. Could you help us out? That's going to be a little more formal. As Jesse knows, sometimes it is scripted. You'll get to that point. Other times just loose talking points. This has gone as far as in previous years, debates, speakers bureaus, things of this sort. So there's a whole lot of stuff in there. And then finally, sort of what I would characterize as a more spontaneous, personal, individual, you guys are out there in the community on your own. What can you do in this space? And Jeff and I talked a lot about this. We think there's a great opportunity here to have each one of you as a force multiplier, if you want to call it a military term, or just more eyes on the streets, more people carrying the water for this agenda. We want to sort of empower you to be able to go out and do that while not risking any of us tripping anybody else. So how this basically works, and this is outlined in the issue brief attachments, we see basically, once the agenda is set, if you guys are out in the community and you're talking to somebody, an acquaintance, a political colleague, and an opportunity comes up you see to advance the agenda, take it. You want to go make a public comment at a meeting and identify yourself as a board member. As long as you're staying in the platform, in the advocacy agenda that we've kind of done, I'm happy to deputize you retroactively. We would ask that you let Jeff know you're going to do these things because we don't want to send somebody to the same meeting you're going to, that sort of thing. But it is essential that we all stay on the same message. If I had a staff person that refused to stay on message and they were in this role, that would be a real problem. So I'm not asking you guys to do anything staff wouldn't do. So a great example of this, a little while ago, one of you was contacted by a sitting city councilor about a resolution pertaining to the state budget issue that Jeff just mentioned. Because of the personal connection, because they knew one of you, and because they knew you were here. So it made sense. One of you then immediately said, let's get Matt involved. And that conversation moved very quickly to, yes, this language works, absolutely yes, thank you for making the connection. That's an example of just one of the ways you guys can be out there as agents in this space, doing that thing to help the agency move its agenda forward. So some of the things we talk here specifically about, speaking at public comment periods, meetings, social gatherings, going on social media. I know Jesse likes social media. You know, sort of the question there is like, do you identify yourself as a board member or a private citizen? Like, obviously, as a private citizen, you can say anything you want to anybody. That's not a question. But if you're identifying yourself as a board member, you are using some of the credibility that Jeff is describing. You're now describing yourself as implicitly speaking for the body. As long as you're on the same platform that we've all sort of agreed to and finalized, I don't care. Go for it. Fill your boots, as they say. Please run. Just give Jeff a call, and make sure we know about it, because he's keeping track of these things and we don't want to trip. So I hope that that kind of gives a pretty wide latitude and answers some questions that have come up periodically about how can I as a board member advocate, and we're happy to have those discussions. I will have a caution about a couple of these things. When you stick your head up, particularly on social media, you make yourself a target. So if you can't stand heat, you know, maybe don't get in the kitchen. So just be prepared for that. The trolls on media in particular. It's a matter of fact of our polarized world. If you're not, I want to be also clear, this is voluntary. None of you have to do any of this stuff. So if you want to, please do, but I just want to make sure you're aware of that. Please don't get out over your skis. Don't pretend you're a subject matter expert if you're not, but speak to the degree you're comfortable with, and then, you know, kick the rest over to staff. We're happy to pick it up and run with it. Jeff and I were talking, yeah, we don't want you starting organized groups or letter writing campaigns or something like that. That's kind of more of an involved staff sort of thing. So please talk to us if you see opportunities in that space. We can sort of work through that as a bit. But from a roles perspective, we see a lot of opportunity for board members as part of this process. And I wanted to just speak to what we'd like to suggest as a place to start on how those roles might pan out. So with that, Jeff, I think we're done. We're happy to begin answering questions.
We can open up the floor now to the board. Susan?
I've got a couple for you. The first is, thank you for doing this. I'd like to get your thoughts on what if I disagree with some of the statements you've put here. So an example, for state and federal, you talk about maintain or expand funding, but for local, you've already gone out ahead of your skis saying that we're going to increase the millage. I'm uncomfortable that a statement's been made before we as a board have made that decision after the millage. You know, there's an example where I guess how we do this, is it that you set the platform and we just say, okay, we're all in, or is there a give and take? Here's an example. I don't feel comfortable with that. I'm just hearing so much from people on fixed incomes about all the millages that are being added to it's not just Headley and all of that stuff. There's just so many millages. So before we've actually had this discussion, that seems very premature to not state it in the same way, maintain or increase. Potentially we could be decreasing. I mean, we tripled it. So I mean, that's just one example on here that I think is definitely a policy choice, but I want to be respectful of where you're coming from, just your expertise in this.
Sure. Sure. I'll handle that one. It's kind of a roles question. So first of all, this is that first bucket of things we want to talk about. Is right now in discussions about this. Let's surface these things. Let's talk about it, because there may be genuine moments where, yeah, there are some professional judgments we're putting in place, and some of you may have some cautions about that or want to get more comfortable about that. In this particular case, you did vote to give us the direction to do that. That's built into the long-range plan that the millage will escalate in the future. So we're not sort of pulling that out of thin air. That is coming from previous discussions we've had. But that doesn't mean we can't change that direction in future discussions as well. I just want to be clear that we didn't make it up and put it on here.
Not to disagree, but we chose to support the 5-year millage. And then there is the long-range plan, and we acknowledge that if we're going to realize that plan, we will have to increase it. But we did not vote to increase the millage. As far as I know, I never voted to have that we're going to be increasing the millage as a policy position right today.
no, I'll be clear about it. Only the board has the authority to put a ballot measure on a ballot to increase a millage. We're not suggesting that that has occurred. We're simply reflecting here that previous discussions and decisions in the long-range plan predicted that we would, at the time, be asking for a millage increase. It's not to be said that that's carved in stone, but that was the direction of the long-range plan. But no, you haven't committed to it. We're not, that's years away, so we have plenty of time to discuss it as well.
Well, I would feel more comfortable if you stated it the same way you stated state and federal. Maintain and/or increase. It doesn't seem like that's an unusual request, just to make it look standard with the other funding sources.
Sure, no, that's absolutely something we can consider.
Because I would feel uncomfortable if someone were to ask me why we've already taken this position.
Sure.
Another small one is, and this is a Forrest statement, I can absolutely get the advocacy to discourage car parking, but a very small tweaky one that jumps out at me is to discourage free parking near the transit corridors. If anything, we've seen people create their own park and ride lots. I saw that when I lived out near Weber's. The neighborhood became a park and ride lot for people to get on the 30. And it wasn't just during art fair, it was also during peak transit periods. So I just want to be sure that when we have statements on here, that we're actually all going to be in agreement about these as our policy positions, because that's not one that I would agree with. I think it's great for people to create free parking for themselves near our transit. It encourages transit, because not everybody is willing to go all the way to Ypsilanti, get on a bus, then get, to where they're going. They may want to pick it up closer to their home. So as we develop this, I'm hoping that we'll have chance for input.
Yeah, I think that's exactly, what we're here for, is to get feedback. This is not set in stone, so very much a living, still moving document. So I think this is exactly what we're looking for.
Another one, you spoke to advocacy groups. I think we are never going to be as impactful if we don't start encouraging advocacy groups. And I don't just mean us as individuals. I mean, you look at how strong the park system has become in the city of Ann Arbor. It's because advocates got behind it. The bike lanes you see everywhere is because the biking community has figured out ways to get involved in the process as individuals, as volunteers. And I think we're hamstringing ourselves by trying to micromanage it all through our staff and how the statements are being made. I think there's benefits to unleashing transit advocates in a way that maybe they're not completely speaking on exactly the way we'd like them to speak, but they're speaking from a passion that they see the value of transit. So I'd like to see us developing that. And then the last thing is, again, back to the university. I hate to keep troubling us, but that challenge about taking road width, the university is already saying that. So I don't know why we don't weave in our own advocacy with what we've already heard them saying they're going to be trying to do. They're trying to create transit corridors and curbs that they're going to be reserved for transit use as a priority. It seems like we're doing this in isolation, and we would be strengthening our hand to be coordinating with the other big transit system in our community.
We are. It's not all the details are here. But
Okay.
We have had conversations with the university about bus lanes specifically. So I don't think anything in here precludes partnerships. I don't think anything in here was intended to preclude activating other grassroots groups to the extent we can. If that makes sense as a tactic,
And
I'm
nor
all
was
for
it continuing the advocacy that takes place behind the scenes as well. So that would be the, conversations, meetings, et cetera, not necessarily in front of the public, but those other conversations that, regularly checking in with stakeholders that we do.
So, and I guess the last thing is, as someone who serves on the board as a volunteer, also as a transit advocate in my other life, I'd like to understand as we go further how those roles can be distinguished. I can certainly speak without saying, and I represent the board when I'm saying these things. Instead, I can say, I know you person is upset because the lane is now being given over to transit. I can say, I'm that person using the bus. I mean, I can, I think, be effective as an advocate, separating that from my role. So I'd like to, as this develops, how we as individuals can be put to use.
Sure, and I'm happy to work with any individual board members on specific messaging that you'd like, or any specific, one-off issue in that regard.
Any other questions or comments for Jeff or Matt? Mike?
It's really nice to see this organized advocacy plan. We've been talking about wanting to do advocacy for several years at the board, and we really haven't had the resources and time to do that. And it's great that you're on board, Jeff, and you and been able to spearhead doing this. I find this very nicely organized. I really like the categories that you've broken it into. I particularly like the information that's in this attachment 2, I think it is here, that Matt expanded on it some about how board members can get involved. I just think this is a terrific start. And I'm very happy to see it, and I'm very eager to see it moving forward. And I think it's great. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
If I could ask, so this is a draft, and we're all excited for what is happening in the future. Do you have a sort of timeline goal of how this is going to move forward? Like, when do you see actually having a plan in place? Are you looking at 6 months, a year?
Yeah, well, I think as far as this develops, I think we might be looking to come back some point in the next couple months with some feedback. And I think at that second point, we'll have a little bit better idea as far as, stamping a date. But that's kind of my intuition on that.
And if I might just add, I think we sort of discussed, as long as we don't have, too many budget presentations, we'd love to get your comments on this initial one, all of them, good, bad, and ugly. I think also by July 10th, sorry, same date as the board, as the business plan, so that we can sort of pull all that together and get it out in the next board packet. And with good input, we may be able to have more nuanced positions on some of these things, for example, precisely where along corridors, shadow park and ride might be an acceptable outcome. Things like that are great, and what we want to hear about, whether it's very granular or whether it's really big picture, all that stuff. So that's sort of short term. Longer term, Jeff is already doing some of these things. We're not waiting on some of these things. The US-23 example, I think you said build the plane while we were flying it. That's happening. We're doing that. We are coming out of our corner and saying more public things than we tend to. I want to make sure we're all on board before we do a whole lot more. And then some of these things, as he alluded to, like the timeline's really hard to predict. Obviously, we're paying a lot of attention to the state budget. We think that's going to be all done by the end of the month. Weird things pop up. Opportunities present themselves, and we need to be, the way we discussed it is, we want to be proactive. We know what we want. We know how we want to get it. But we need to be flexible enough to walk into somebody's office, prepared to talk about issue A, and they say, I really want to talk about issue B. We're going to pivot. We're going to pivot right there in front of them to make the best lemonade out of that situation we possibly can. So some of these timelines are very fluid. I want to firm this up, hopefully next month, time permitting, just so we all kind of know what the platform is, but we're already starting.
Yeah, to be clear, I should have said in terms of board involvement, not your involvement, and didn't mean to imply that you haven't already been doing the hard work that you've been doing. But you've talked about that you would like us to be on the same platform as you, and I'm wondering what that will look like. Will it come to us in the form of a board meeting? Will it come to us in the form of an issue brief? How will we know what platform is developed and when to use it, and/or what platform we were using that is no longer effective and may need to change?
All of that is kind of to be determined.
So this is all just the beginning discussion?
This is part of the plane we haven't built yet.
Okay.
My expectation, my vision for that is we'll revisit this at least once a year or as often as needed, because things can change quickly. Presidential administrations could cause a wholesale rewrite of many things here. And for example, deregulation may shoot to the top because we think we have a better shot in that space than others. But I think it's important for all of us who may want to participate to have a document like this, you know, the version on it and a date on it and Jeff's phone number to, you know, to say, hey, you know, I'm going to this party. It's a block party, but I know so-and-so is going to be there and they're influential. And is it still okay to say X, Y, Z? And Jeff can just be like, absolutely, go ahead, fill your boots, let me know how it goes.
And add this in there.
Or wave you off, to be like, and like this week, particularly with the SOAR thing in Lansing, like every day is a soap opera and kind of slamming from one side, we're on Roth, we're on Roth. It's very hard in that case to try to discern exactly, should we be saying anything? Or is that just drawing fire that we don't need? So some of those things are very in the moment.
Thank you very much for that. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none. Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, Julie.
No need to respond at this point. I just would also like us to think about prioritization and potentially how some of the elements in the buckets interact with one another. And especially as we're heading into, say, like a millage year or some other critical pinch points, what might we want to focus more or less on in terms of, again, no, you don't need to respond to that.
No,
just-
I
yeah.
definitely think that's something good worth mentioning and definitely something worth thinking of, and we'll put more pen on paper and doing, because that is really important depending on what message we're trying to send at a given time.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you, gentlemen, very much. We're going to move on to the fiscal year 24 quarter 2 service report, and that is Mr. George Brooks. Or their industrial fan. Last year, we had a big fan. Thank you. There we go.
Good evening, everyone. Tough to follow all the heavy hitters, Matt and Rosa, Dina and Jeff. But I'm gonna speak on the Q2 service report. I'm not gonna read everything, but I wanna hit on a few things that I think really is a culmination of a lot of the successes that we've put together over the last year and a half, and some positive things are starting to show up. Pointing out to the first check mark on page 82nd, the top left, is the average miles between road calls. We had a positive result of a 14% improvement. This is in direct correlation of how many buses break down while they're out in the field. So a very nice improvement. A good shout out to Troy Lundquist and his team that really are dedicated to continuous improvement and making the fleet run better. Our on-time performance is trending higher. We had initially thought about setting the standard of 70%. We chose to push it up higher. Our standard is trying to meet 80% on-time performance. Over the last, I believe, 4 quarters, we have routinely met that and exceeded it. I'm very happy to report that. On the right side of the first page, you can see that if you compare the boardings from Q2 2023 over Q2 2024, we had an increase of 50,000 rides. So we're really trending in a positive manner there. Turn the page to 83, or the second page of the Q2 service report. Again, this reiterates our fixed route ridership is steadily increasing. And as the ridership increase, of course, our cost of boarding is going down. If you look at MV on the third page, again, more need for the service. We are seeing increases in boarding. it's pretty much, very, very similar to our fixed ridership. It's, the increase is steady and gradually increasing. The van pool also, it's not as big as a jump, but we're still trending in a positive manner. We're working on a new contract at the present time, possibly replacing the service provided by TheRide, well, with another contractor. I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement, and we're working diligently on that. At one time, we had reached a high of 56 denials, and we've been working diligently to lower that as much as we can. We are definitely trending almost 50% down from when we reached our peak. And then if you move to page 6, the D2A2 ridership is continuously going forward and going up. And again, on the last page, just to reiterate that for the last 5 quarters now, we are meeting or exceeding the 80% expectation of on-time performance. Any other questions or concerns you'd like to ask me before I close out?
The floor is open to the board. Does anyone have a question or a comment? I don't see any, George.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the CEO report and ZEB updates. Back to Matt.
I was going to make a joke about how much I was going to talk, but in the interests of brevity, I will say we've covered many of the subjects here through our discussions this evening. I don't know, we still haven't heard anything on ZEB, but we don't expect to hear back on that grant until July. So perhaps we'll have some announcements for you 2 weeks or more from now. I do want to thank the city of Ypsilanti for their help in placing our throne bathroom. You may have seen some of them around the city of Ann Arbor. The city of Ann Arbor approached us about going in on that project to help meet sort of a bulk purchasing target they were hitting. We committed to getting one, and after a little bit of scrambling, frankly, to find a location, the city of Ypsilanti came through for us. And so we are hopeful that it holds up as well in that urban environment as they are reporting it holds up in DC and other places. We do anticipate a little bit of questions from the public, as Jeff is aware. That bathroom there is seen as a supplemental staff bathroom. It is not open to the public, but we are reminding people on it that there are public bathrooms available inside. This is because with the increase of service at the Ypsilanti Transit Center, the one staff bathroom is simply not adequate to handle the number of drivers who show up and have a very short period of time to answer nature's call. So that was the intent of this. It is a 1-year pilot. It is not a cheap pilot, I'm going to be honest with you. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it holds up in an urban environment. We'll see how the public reacts to it. But we do thank the city of Ypsilanti for helping us find a home there. And we do want to thank or welcome Andy. And he has a newbie twin, Raymond Hess, also joined our team same day. So we're excited to have Raymond in there. At that, I will just see if anyone has any questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Matt on the CEO report? Did you want to say something, Forrest?
Sorry, I should have coordinated with Matt. I just want to add one thing before I know there's some questions. I just got some latest numbers or ridership numbers on the Express Bus. We launched 6 weeks ago. So we did expect some ridership increase, but initially on day one or your first week, we got about 100 rides per day. Right now, we're up to 350 rides per day. But the good news is they're not just from Route 4. Adding up Route 4 and Express Bus, we see an increase of 350 new rides per day. So that's pretty significant for a new service just in 6 weeks. But of course, this is an early stage, some preliminary number. but I want to kind of share that good news. And the key message, as we talk about the millage, right? So this is not the first one, the first service-related initiative we implemented. So we kept our promise, and we see some positive results. So, sorry for.
No, that was wonderful. I was actually wondering myself, I see the 104 a lot. It's interesting to see how you have mitigated the concern of how do they decide what's the 104 and what's the 4. I've noticed that the bus is traveling in the left-hand lane and it says out of service, but as soon as it gets near its time point where it becomes the 104, it changes its route. And I think that's a really good way of alerting the public, and helps the public understand the difference between those two routes. So I want to say thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any questions for anyone else? Mike?
Yeah, Matt, I see in your notes that you made a presentation to the Ann Arbor City Council this week. I was wondering what that was about and how it went.
Yeah, thank you. So several months ago, Mayor Taylor invited TheRide and the Ann Arbor DDA to begin making operational updates to council at the beginning of their meetings. We trade off every other month. So Mara from the DDA goes, and then I go, and then she goes, and sort of back and forth. So I end up going every other month. We've been doing it now 6, 8 months. I've been maybe 3 or 4 times. It is a very brief opportunity to simply let council know what's going on. The mayor has simply asked for operational updates from the CEO. He hasn't given me any more explicit direction, nor has he called me up to tell me I got it wrong. So I think basically I continue to use it as an opportunity to build relationships. I know many of the council members, but every time we're there, it sort of raises our profile a little. And I talk about usually the latest, I think, most topical things. This time, remind me, Jeff, I spoke about the 104 services, the new services coming in that we hadn't heard about, the ZEB thing yet, but we weren't expecting any to. YTC update, although it was brief because this is Ann Arbor City Council. In previous ones, I've gone into more detail, for example, about the ZEB proposal, because I know, through A20 that that's something that they care quite a bit about. So we talk a little bit more about our plans in that respect. But it's at this point a very sort of, the mayor has requested it, so of course we go. It's done, it's over in 5 minutes. They do not allow themselves to ask questions. So I'm there. I usually have some wingmen. Thank you for being with. And we're there before public comment begins, which is a relief in some cases. And we can just sort of be on our way. Yeah.
Very good. Any other questions? All right, that'll close out that portion of the evening. We'll go, oh wait, I'm sorry. Oh, Jeff.
One more shameless plug, TheRide is participating and will be Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti for the life race this year, very exciting. If anyone is interested still, and we have a couple signups, feel free to let us know. We order some extra t-shirts and plenty of candy.
Excellent. I encourage everybody to attend if they're able to. I've not been with TheRide because this is our first time there, but I have gone with other groups, and it's quite exciting to walk and talk with the public and interact. It's an excellent opportunity to get some ownership linkage in as well.
Let's hope the weather is okay.
Yes, fingers crossed on the weather. Although, would that mean they get to ride in the bus if the weather's bad? No. All right, we're going to move on to action item recap. Mr. Carpenter and Ms. Holt.
Thank you, and Deb can correct me, any of you can, if I get this wrong. So first of all, you've made a decision, your July meeting will be at the FC Riverside Arts Center to Dodge Art Fair, I think an excellent choice. The Open Dialogue Task Force, I think maybe the next step you had suggested, Rich, is sort of digging into whether the policies we already have pertaining to those social goals are adequate or not. Kathleen expressed in the monitoring of, I think, 3811, maybe some increased focus on ongoing training and perhaps orientation. You can correct me in the minutes if I get that wrong. Safety policy, you have all sort of signaled to Jesse that it is very likely it ends, and that seems to be a great relief to him. Otherwise, it's going back to Service Committee to have more dialogue about the scope. Riders, traveling public, specifically for who, I think is what his intention was there. You made some decisions modifying the policy manual. Your item 6.2 changes to policy 3.2 on the board job description was approved unanimously, as was changes to 3.7.2B, the executive committee and the task force thing. So that constitutes a change to your policy manual. I'll ask Deb to get started on that next week. We will, after those edits are made, we will promulgate a new policy manual, distribute it electronically, put it online. If you'd like a hard copy, please let us know. We'll certainly get it to you. And for a couple of big meansy things, the business plan and the advocacy agenda, we really look forward to hearing your feedback by July the 10th on both of them. I would, reiterate our thing there. We'll take your comments, written, skywriting, whatever you want to do. Feel free to call us directly and we'll talk through any concerns you may have as well or questions. We're happy to do that, and we will respond quickly as we can to every individual comment. So I think that's all I had for action items.
Very good.
Thank you.
Topics for next meeting will be the business plan, the draft budget preview, our governance process policies 3.0 through 3.4, asset protection 2.7, environmental sustainability 2.11, and we'll hear a report on Falls on Buses. That leaves us to and our next meeting is at the Ypsilanti Riverside Art Center on July 18th, 2024, which leads us to 9.3, public comment. Deb, is there anyone online still?
Yes, Robert Pulowski, and you are unmuted.
Thank you, Deborah. Good evening to the board again. Robert Plowski with the Citizens Advisory Committee through the RTA and longtime transit advocate. First off, I'd like to give a big kudos to the team, especially the CEO, on the advocacy training. I think that was really well done, especially encouraging the board to get out and really get in more involved with advocating for transportation. And most of all, I would invite the CEO and his team, if possible. We would love to have a training like that as well. And also, we would love to have you come and present in front of our committee. We just had actually our meeting just this Monday, and we have had discussions over recent agenda items and partnerships we can have with other agencies. So anything that we can do to partner with TheRide to really influence our committee, whether that's through advocacy trainings, informal talks on what the service is doing, or just future topics on what we can do in terms of public engagement to help the service, because we do have a lot of members that sit on our committee through Ann Arbor, so it'd definitely be a help. So I encourage the CEO or anyone on staff, if they would love to partner with us, please feel free to get in contact with me. I believe Deborah has my information if needed. But also, I want to give a big kudos to Dina on her budget presentation. With the SOAR bills that were currently going on, it's supposed to be voted on in the House today. It really shows the need that transportation, but as you know, the ride's going to be able to stay stable past this budget season once we get into the fall with some of these SOAR bills. I am on an advocacy side encouraging our legislators, including my local legislator here in the Downriver communities, to not just advocate for transportation in our community, but focus mostly on our state, because it's not just the community you serve on you're voting with these bills. It is entire package. It is the entire state when it comes to all transportation agencies, whether that's through northern Michigan, the southern portion of Michigan, and some of these rural communities, or even Grand Rapids, so to speak. But we also need to really consider the fact of operating costs in the near future. And that's what really my comment was geared to earlier in this meeting. But when we talk about engagement, like I said, the board is the critical asset on feedback. And I did appreciate a lot of the open dialogue from Susan regarding some critiques, specifically with the advocacy training, because that's the type of open dialogue that we try to have on our committees as well. Again, the service is outstanding. I also want to give a big shout out to the 104 I have been keeping tabs on some of the pullout rates and a lot of the service performance on the 104. And I've also talked to a lot of people recently over Zoom on how that's improving their daily lives. And the 104 has been a really big change and big game changer here in our community, especially in Ypsilanti, with riders trying to get back and forth from Ann Arbor, because anyone's ridden the 4, and I know probably Jesse has encountered this very much, it is a slow ride with a lot of pulling of the cord and stopping left and right, and the commute just takes more than an hour to get down to Ypsilanti or even to Ann Arbor. But I appreciate all of the board's support and all of the legislative dollars we've gotten into this and all the capital projects we're able to invest in this. And it'll be a nice addition when the Ypsilanti Transit Center opens in the near future. Again, thank you so much for your time. And if anyone's interested in partnering with us at the Citizens Advisory Committee, please feel free to get in contact with me. I'd be happy to shoot my contact info over to any staff that's interested. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your weekend. Take care.
Deb, is there anyone else?
We have no more other for public comment.
That closes out public comment. We're going to move on to 9.4 adjournment. Would anyone like to make a motion to adjourn? Don't all jump at once. Jesse, seconded by Susan, and all in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.